Bandwidth provided by Recursive Squirrel Interactive. Visit them on the web at recursivesquirrel.com. Episode 618, the 2020 Year-End Review. For Monday, December 21st, 2020. It's time for the special year-end edition of the BeanCast, an annual look at the biggest topics we covered over the last year. I'm your host, Bob North. Thanks for joining us. Well, our 12th annual look back at the year coming to a close is as odd and surreal as the year which we are discussing. But despite the obvious heartbreaking realities of this tumultuous time, in true BeanCast fashion, we managed to find the bright and humorous side of the biggest headlines of 2020. So grab your favorite holiday beverage, maybe cozy up to a fire, and get ready for this, because it's bound to be a show to remember. Now, let's meet tonight's panel. Thanks for joining us for this week's BeanCast. I'm Bob Norp, and with me on the panel for this evening, we start with the woman who gets quoted by me more than anyone else on the show, the founder and lead consultant at the Difference Engine, Ms. Farrah Bostic. Farrah, hi.
Hey, Bob. Which lies of mine are you repeating?
Oh, so many lies. Now, next, he's the Chief Marketing Officer for AutoZen, but you know him as the smartest man in the world. Mr. Saul Colt is here. Hi, Saul.
Bob, it's very, very exciting to be here. You know, just the other day, I was named the 109th most influential person in India. No joke. And I woke up today and I'm doing this show. Things are really turning around for me.
I don't know how to respond to that, but I'm just going to let it lie. Now, also with us, we have the host of Corona TV, author, speaker, consultant, Mr. Joseph Jaffe. Hi, Joe.
I'm upset because I was voted number 110th most influential person in India, and so, you know, I mean, I don't understand. What does he have that I don't?
I have it on good authority that you're the number one most influential person at Smucker's, so we'll keep it there. But anyway,
listen, Joe, 2021 is our year.
Now
we're going to break into the top 100.
And finally, he's the host of the marketing podcast Across the Pond, as well as managing partner with CI Squared. Mr. Samuel Monnie is here. Hi, Sam.
Hey, Bob. Influential in my own mind, and I like being number one in that list. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Well, you all know the drill, but for those of you who are tuning in for the first time to our year-end show, this is kind of a free-for-all. We don't take any breaks. We just keep going all the way through this. We spend only a few minutes on every topic, and we get just an overview of the biggest topics from the past year. And I'm not going to bury the lead about this year. The pandemic is the news. So many topics rolled out from this particular one topic. So first of all, let's talk about how the pandemic both crushed and made the advertising advertising world shine. I mean, there were layoffs, there were missed numbers. WPP misreported most of 2020, we found out over the last couple of weeks. I mean, it's been a disaster of a year, Farrah. So what do you think? What do you think about the way that this has made the agencies both reimagine how they do business and maybe get a little bit better, and maybe kind of it might have destroyed a lot of the industry? What do you think?
I have to say, when you called my name, I felt like you were blaming me for it. And so,
Yeah, Farrah,
so you know, so be it.
Fully, it's my fault.
I do think that, you know, this has become kind of the aphorism of the pandemic, is that really what it has done is really kind of amplified and made more extreme things that were already happening, really kind of revealed essential truths that we were kind of pretending didn't exist before.
That's really interesting.
Degree,
that perspective, that it's revealing things that were already lying in wait. Is that true in every case?
Well, I think in every case, I'm allergic to that sort of overgeneralization, but I think it is true in a lot of cases. And I think things like misreporting one's earnings is not a thing that the pandemic created. It's a thing that happens in large businesses with slightly astonishing levels of frequency. I think finding out that, and I know we'll talk about this later on, that certain agency leaders might have certain opinions about race. It wasn't invented by the pandemic. That was always there. It just, in a year of both pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement coming to a head, particularly around the killing of George Floyd, you have just bright lights shining in all kinds of directions. And I think it reveals some things about, everything from how many people really need to be on a shoot to how, these large holding companies report their earnings, to the real opinions of the people who are shaping culture through advertising. And I think those that shine or have taken the opportunity to shine into the pandemic were the ones who were doing good work quietly all along. And the ones who are not shining were the ones who were not that great to begin with. I'm not sure that this really changed anybody. I think it just made certain things worse or better, depending on which direction they were headed in the first place. That's my general theory.
One of the biggest learnings from this year is that, we all can agree now more than ever that we're all in this together, and that companies are going to let us buy their products. But I agree with what Farrah said. I think the layoffs, they were, I'm going to say it differently. She sort of spoke fast. The layoffs were an easy excuse to, not hold on to redundant staff based on client reactions to the pandemic. And, when you looked at things like, how things change, you found out that you could make a lot of really great creative for way less money than they were charging. You didn't need cars to make car ads.
Interrupt you for Let me interrupt you for a second there, because that's one of the things that I think is a fallacy of all this, that there's redundant staff and that we're charging too much for ads. In some senses, there was a lot of waste, but there's also big news in the headlines over the past few weeks about just total burnout from people being overworked because of so many layoffs.
Absolutely. I think the 2020 has been, as Farrah was talking about, shining a light on things and bad behaviors, bad culture, bad leadership. And, in the last few weeks, it's been the first time that it's okay when a leader on a call says, how is everybody? It's okay to actually to tell the truth and start crying and be and really reveal emotions, because the more and more data is coming through that people are overworked, overstretched. They are stressed at home. It's the first time in modern history that for a lot of people, they're parents, they are professionals, and they're also educators all at the same time. I've had so many conversations with colleagues who are feeding kids or educating kids whilst running meetings. And so the human side of this is really revealing. And I think the agency world has not had an abundance of credit for being the most human, the best cultural, the best cultures. And I think people are renegotiating that. And the challenge is, how do the leaders who run these organizations, there's been a human side of COVID, and then the Black Lives Matter, the social movements, Me Too before that, all of this stuff going on in the world. How has the agency world, how has the creative world adapted or amended? And I'm optimistic, because you see organizations and different models coming through who are actually just doing things differently, like paying people for vacation and paying people healthcare as freelancers. So different models which are treating people better and being more attractive than the traditional model, which perhaps saw people as an expense or cost center. And so I think that humanity is coming through. Although I don't think the most creative way of demonstrating that is for all of these ads that we saw where these CEOs suddenly said, we care about you. And as Saul said, we're there for you, which smacked as it's insincere, because the same CEOs, people are saying, hey, we don't get health insurance. We're frontline workers and we're at risk, and you're not paying us minimum wage. So, it's an interesting dynamic where when the light's being shone on things, I think we are now, especially as consumers and as employees, more discerning. And as we go into 2021 and things bounce back, I think people are going to make smart choices about where they spend their money and where they work.
Well, Samuel, you said one word, the word revealing, and I think that to me is one of the common threads in this year, right? Which is this was a year in which people revealed themselves and they revealed their true selves. And the old saying is, if somebody tells you who they are, believe them. And I think what we saw, it's very hard also to separate the marketing as it relates to COVID and the pandemic, because we had waves, right? We've discussed these throughout the year. There was from COVID to Black Lives Matter to we're open again, everybody come back, let's milk it, all the way back to Black Friday, to Gap and post-election, and these empty messages of of unity. But I'll say two things. One is we're having a whole, so far, the discussion about the agency world. The agencies are just lackeys or lapdogs for the marketers. Ultimately the buck stops with the budget, and the buck stops with the budget holder, and the direction is coming from these corporations, number one. Number two, just before we go there, there's another unspoken thread as well as it relates to corporations and specifically badly behaving agencies, and that's ageism as well. And that is something that, inclusivity, diversity, ageism, representation across constituencies, there's a lot of work to be done. So forget about whether the creative works or doesn't, whether the messages are tone deaf or aren't, and whether these companies are listening or not. The fact is they're still not necessarily acting like model citizens at all.
One of the most interesting things about the pandemic and its effect on agencies is something that Farrah brought up. That realization that we can rethink the creative process, that we can rethink the production process, and that we can come up with a more streamlined, if not more, some ways complicated because of all the COVID restrictions, but in a lot of ways streamlined ways of producing high quality ads. Were we really successful at that, Farrah? Was it a good year for creative?
I think it was a slow start, and a lot of it had to do with country by country or state by state differences and what the kind of COVID restrictions were. It seemed like there was, let's go back through the ads we've already produced or footage we already have and use that. Then it was, you can get some pretty good stock footage these days. A lot of pharma, when you watch the ads,
I always thought that one Mint Mobile ad was phenomenal, where they just used stock footage throughout the whole thing and made fun of the fact that they were using stock footage. It was quite clever.
Exactly. Yes. And now I think as other countries have done a better job of managing the pandemic within their own borders, you do have places where you can do, you can have sets, you can have actors, you can have shoots in a more traditional way, still with different restrictions, obviously, around health, but you can do those things remotely. The US based agency crew, the creative director does not need to be on site for a shoot happening in a country where things are better. They can do that through Zoom, and they are doing that through Zoom. And I've even seen in my own business, I've been working remotely for a long time and using remote tools for qualitative research for a long time. This was the year that clients finally said, I'm willing to actually think that might be a good approach, and that you don't actually have to be on the ground in person with people to have meaningful conversations with them. Now, a year into this, would I like to go be in person with some people? Yes, please. But at the same time, it is possible to do it. Now, the thing about this is, and I think this is kind of what we were just talking about too, is I think the big reveal there is it's not actually less work. It just means I don't have to get on a plane also. It means I don't have to spend all that time in transit also. It means I can be in my office doing other work while watching a shoot through the Zoom connection. And the problem with that is we're all stuck at home if we're in this kind of work, and we have, many of us, kids who are being, hybrid schooled or homeschooled. We have no childcare in our homes. If we, used to have some place to drop off the toddler, all of those things are out the window. And so now the total sum of effort that goes into a day is happening simultaneously. And I think agency life, consulting services in general, have relied on a wife and other help. And as long as there is no wife and other help, the shy it day and night kind of pride of, we work hard and we play hard and whatever, no one wants to, everything's hard. More hard is not appealing. So I think like there was an evolution in like production quality, and I think that's gotten better over the year. I think the need to do those, times are tough all over and we're here for you kind of sappy messaging has mostly faded away, and I'm grateful for that too. But I do wonder how much, given how much people want to go back to normal, how much we will actually have learned the lessons of what this work really entails. And frankly, when you had 500 employees in an office, there was more air cover. If somebody needed to duck out early to go pick up their kids from daycare or take a kid to a doctor's appointment, there were lots of other people around to cover that work. And if you downsize your workforce, you can't do that. And if we're all stuck at home doing 12 things simultaneously, it's hard to do that. So I'm kind of not persuaded that the other side of this is necessarily better. I think that betterness will be unevenly distributed, and the people who will do great work on the other side were the people who were doing great work before. I'm just sort of an ever was, I guess, theorist on this.
But there were some great COVID ads, and I call them COVID ads because I don't know if this was the best ad of the year, obviously not, but one of the best ads I saw that clearly, hinted at the fact that the world had changed was Honda did a really captivating ad using a die-cast car, of the car they were trying to sell. And it was basically like, it looked just like a regular ad, cars zooming through.
Wasn't that done in Dubai? Wasn't that for Dubai for Honda?
I don't know where it was from. I just know it was a Honda ad or whatever. But they completely referenced the fact that this was a die-cast car, and the world has changed. But still buy our products. But the fact that they referenced it was a die-cast car, the fact that someone thought about doing that, it came out really, really early in the lockdown of the world. So while everyone else's creative was, people in scrubs standing in front of stock photography of an American flag, these guys tried to put out something
with ubiquitous sad piano music. You have to remember the sad piano music in every single ad.
Well, I just want to build on something that a few people have said, and that's the thing. There is absolute room for creativity. So what this is helping us see is the role and the value of creativity, and we notice that more. And so I've seen more animation, like claymation type creative now from brands. I think one that's coming to mind is Best Buy, which has usually has characters in human form, but they've now doing it in sort of digital animation form. But equally, I saw there's a company called System One. They do a lot of research of analyzing ads, and ultimately, we need more right brain content. If you believe in the left-right brain, then more right brain creative content. And there's a Macy's ad where a young little black girl, she's trying to buy her dad a gift for holidays, and suddenly metamorphosizes into his shoes physically, and everyone who looks at her sees the father and gives her tips on what to get her father. And it's very human, it's very emotive, there's very little branding, there's more storytelling, and it comes out really strongly in creativity. So I think what we now know to be true, even if we didn't know it before, and if the CFO had the purse strings on the budget, is creativity absolutely matters, and the people bringing it to you also matter. And it's not going to be cheaper because it's virtual, because the same level of strategy, the same level of creativity, the same level of thinking and decision making still applies. And so I know there's been a lot of cost cutting in the agency world, but also what needs to happen is rebalancing that power of what clients pay for. And I'm speaking out both sides because I've kind of been on both sides of the fence, and actually educating clients on what they are paying for versus, oh, now we're doing everything virtually and you're not flying anywhere, we're going to cut the cost. So I think there is an opportunity to really 2021 to drive creativity and to champion that. And the marketing leaders, the brand leaders who ask for more of that will win.
But travel is not an inconsequential cost for production. I mean, travel can be a huge part of the cost when you're sending so many people and you're sending so much equipment to these vast, these exotic locations around the globe. I mean, it's just like they were able to do things cheaper and more efficiently here. What wasn't that kind of the big story, Joe, behind all this? I mean, this idea that you can do things a little bit more cheaply, a little bit more efficiently. I mean, Sam's point is really strong that, it takes the same amount of work in planning and prep. But when you're actually producing the ad, there are ways to cut costs. And I think we've found that out as an entire industry this year.
I mean, listen, to me, it's kind of no disrespect to anyone on the show today, but like I couldn't give a crap about, you know, cost cutting and cost savings and saving money on travel. I mean, at the end of the day, any cost savings should probably be passed on to take care of employees, and probably wasn't. I think, you know, I mean, you were asking about great creative. There were a lot of, I think Saul said it best, you know, at the end of the day, it was always, oh, and by the way, buy my product. Now, here's the point. No one should begrudge or any company trying to make money and trying to survive during these tough times. No one. And anyone that kind of points a finger at them is kind of like a little bit, you know, deluded. However, there's a lack of, I think, integrity and credibility with these large corporations, partly because of the way that they have treated their employees, or just the fact that they haven't really, you know, demonstrated any kind of commitment, you know, to making the world better. And that's why, like, when you look at Nike, you know, Nike hit it out the park, you know, with their incredible piece of creative. Now, my point being, and I'm not trying to, like, you know, go on a rant here, even though I'm ranting, is like, I don't care about the production values. They should have spent more money on it, because it was a piece of creative that was credible when we saw this whole idea of unity and coming together. Because of the work that they've done and because of their commitment as a company to these issues and to being activists of sorts, they were able to deliver a message that we all needed. And again, why would we begrudge that coming from a brand? We wouldn't begrudge it coming from a brand. I guess my disappointment here is that I always go back to this. When we went through the last crisis economically as a country, Hyundai took out a Super Bowl commercial and they said, lose your job, give back your car. Why didn't we see more of that? Why didn't we see the message? I'm less worried about the media. The message should be, you can make money still, you can still keep the wheels of commerce going, but you can also actually elevate yourself in the process.
Let's double down on that subject, because that's a really important part of how the industry has changed. We came to almost come to Jesus moment here, where it became a debate about, should we be inspiring? Are brands allowed to be inspiring? Can we be very much focused on the we're in it together theme, or should we be funny in this time? Should we be selling more directly? You know, you bring up marketing messaging. I mean, what did we learn about both the brands that are being put in this position and the customers that are having to deal with this situation? I mean, how did we evolve?
I mean, I think one of the problems is kind of almost implicit in, sorry, Bob, but in the question, which is like, should we be funny? Should we have sappy music? Should we, you know, try to do original creative or repurpose old stuff or buy stuff? Like, those are tactics. The question I think that Joe is getting at is like, who do we want to be in this new world that we're in? What do we stand for? And like, you know, I think, yes, there's always going to be an example of like a clever execution that someone managed to work around the new realities of whatever the latest crisis is. But there are bigger questions under all of this. And I guess that's probably part of my kind of neutral pessimism about anything transformational actually having transpired here. I'm not sure any real lessons have been learned if the most exciting thing we can say is we figured out how to do a shoot without being on site or without having a real car.
But I think that's why brands like, you know, Ben and Jerry's will always win, because they 5-6 years ago took the stance about you know, equality, inclusion, representation, and they made, you know, their mission is to, you know, end white supremacy, and they put that in the front of their website, and they've just launched a Save Our World product with Colin Kaepernick, and it's just true to the DNA of the brand. So I'm coming back to this whole brand meaning, brand purpose, brand what you stand for as a business, and the brand that's woven so through your organization, your culture, decision making, your profits, that, you know, the founders got arrested a couple of years ago because they were protesting protesting in favor of marriage equality. And when your CEOs go to jail, it's not because they're stealing money, it's because they're actually getting arrested for protesting and causing such a ruckus.
Let me stop you for a second.
Core to the brand.
Let me stop you for a second.
So
Sam, I want to agree with Sam wholeheartedly here, and I want to kind of drill down on that because, you know, we think about purpose as being a cause, and I think that this is the year where we separated cause from purpose in a lot of really fundamental ways. Because when you have a cause, when you support a charity, that is not a purpose for your brand. A purpose is a real mindset, a real way of operating. Is that what you're going at, Sam?
Yeah, and that's the beauty of it. So it's easy. You know, the story of Ben & Jerry's is a few years ago, they had a town hall internally, said, look, this is a real issue of discrimination and lack of inclusion, and we're going to do something about it. And some of their people walked out. Some of the owners walked out and said, look, you guys, no, that's not, we're just here to sell ice cream. And they said, yeah, we're an ice cream brand, but we stand for so much more. And this is to say, they had the tough conversation 5-6 years ago. And so they've woven it into the DNA of the brand. And so that's what you sign up for when you work for this company. So whatever the issue is, they are going to represent the side of equality, of inclusion, of fairness, of transparency. They may not always get it right, but that's why the Nikes of this world get lauded for their ads. But then you look at their leadership and there's virtually 3 of the 12 board members are diverse, and they have a lack of representation in leadership. You have Pinterest, and their COO, I think, has just won a court case for discrimination. So you have all of these companies saying stuff and advertising stuff. And then, I mean, you could go to Timnit Gebru at Google right now, the AI researcher who's basically leading a mutiny because the employee, she got fired or she was asked to leave or whatever, and because of some of the work she's done on the bias in algorithms at Google. So all of these companies are compromised. And do they step up, or do they, Farrah talked about shining light, do they reveal who they truly are and what really motivates them? And for a lot of these big companies, we truly know who they are. And I think for me, the opportunity of 2021 is the brands, the businesses, companies who are going to actually replace or displace them, because I know I am going to spend more money with certain people and less money with others. For example, I think I've said before in this show, I sold my Facebook stock. Not that I was loaded with loads of them, but I just could not consciously own stock in a company that I just feel just was not doing the right thing. And I try as hard as possible not to use their product and brand. It's hard in the real world, but I think there are opportunities for us as consumers and us as humans to make different choices. And I think in 2021, you'll see more of that. And I think you'll see.
I think
that
you guys. I think
Sam.
you guys all. I just want to say, I think you guys. Just very quickly, I think you guys all nailed it, and I was just about to. I'm glad because I was about to, and Saul's going to bring us home as well with another comment. Everything that you guys just said, Bob, the idea of separation of cause and purpose, it's all absolutely spot on. So just kudos to all of you. I want to say one more thing, and this is, I'm starting to sound like Saul Colt, because he'll always preempt everything he says, and this might be a controversial statement, but I think you're going to see one of the greatest examples, regardless of your political leanings or affiliations, in terms of diverse representation, is Joe Biden's cabinet. And we're going to see very transparently in this country whether in fact it's going to work, whether in fact it works or it doesn't. And it's just as simple as that. It doesn't matter what your political affiliations are, given the challenges that are ahead for us economically, socio-economically, this unprecedented representation of diversity across the board. We've always said that a board, a management, a C-suite should reflect the actual people that they serve and that they sell to. And we're going to get to see firsthand whether in fact it works and how well it works.
All right, so I'm just going to just comment on something Sam said. First of all, thank you for taking all of my points for our Black Lives Matter discussion later, talking about.
Well, hey, it's on equity.
Ben & Jerry's and DNA, but and I am, I think, a bit of the Nike apologist on this show universally. But to say that there's only a handful of Black people on the board, I've been to Portland about 800 times, and I've only seen about 100 Black people in the whole city. So it's probably representative of the population, but that's a poor joke. But what I do want to say is I think, we've talked a million times about this, about how social media levels the playing field, and we talked about it a couple of weeks ago on the show, or even maybe last week. But there's no better, example of it, of giving people an amplified voice than when they do attack brands, through the either the anonymity of their keyboard or just the fact that, the anonymity of their screen. However, but man, you talk about DNA and you talk about brands who stand out. The brands that did take a stand, who have never taken a stand before, and they were doing it perhaps more opportunistically, they got killed. And I think, should brands do it or should brands not do it? Should they be funny or thing? Brands should always continue doing whatever they've been doing pandemics and all sorts of things. I've mentioned it many times. I wrote a thing on LinkedIn in March that got a fair bit of traction about how KFC should have switched their finger licking good slogan to finger washing good, and that was a way they could have actually ridden the wave of the conversation. It was very true to their brand. It spoke to their sense of humor, the way they do all sorts of things, and they ended up doing it, I think, in August or September. Didn't give me any credit or pay me or anything, but by that time it was such a safe thing to do that it had no impact, and it was even more of it was more awkward to do it in August or September than if they had actually did it in the height of when everything was going on. So I think that the companies that do it all the time, and I sort of disagree with you about Nike. I think Nike did an incredible job of creative on it, but it's also, I believe it is part of Nike's DNA. And when you do look at their sub brands like Jordan Brand is about 65 or 75% Black run and managed, and most of the teams on there. So, perhaps, I don't know the whole, racial makeup of the entire company, but I do know Jordan Brand really over-indexes on African Americans, and whether that's by choice or whatever, it's just good to see. But companies that have been doing it forever, they're allowed to do it, and companies that are just jumping in, they shouldn't be doing it. Popeye's Chicken, and I know we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter later. Popeye's Chicken made some really weird Black Lives Matter, like weird kind of like uncomfortable jokes, and they got killed for it because it wasn't part of their brand. And of course, I don't know, just companies that do it all the time should continue doing it, and you shouldn't stop what you're doing just because the world is going on. You should adapt. You should, sort of see how you still fit. Make sure you're not, you're not completely on the wrong side of history and things like that. But, if you've always been funny, be funny. If you've always taken a stand, take a stand. It's more noticeable, these companies that make sharp left turns or sharp right turns at any sign of adversity, that stands out more than continuing the path.
I learned that from you, Saul. I mean, I was actually going for a run, listening to the BeanCast. The show is called The Year in Review, and I thought you nailed it when you said it back then. And you basically said the best thing that these companies could do or should do. And I remember just like shouting out while I was going for a run, yes, which, as you said, basically is just to say, listen, we don't know all the answers right now, and so we're listening. We're listening and we're learning, and we'll get back to you, or at least that was the message and the communication. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what they should have done.
There's one other thing about the transformation of the advertising industry and as a result of COVID that I want to cover before we move on to the next topic. And that's conferences. Obviously, one of the big news stories from the early pandemic was the canceling of Cannes and the moving of Cannes. And Cannes was already in there was a lot of debate about the value of it over the past couple of years. Having this pandemic kind of hit them and hit a lot of the conference industry was pretty disruptive to things. I mean, suddenly we're doing things online. The speakers are not being paid or compensated in any way anymore. Many of the speakers who make a living doing this were now forced to be doing virtual seminars. I know two of you actively do a lot of conferences. So I'm going to start with Farrah. How do we address this? I mean, how do we deal with this going forward? Is this going to be the norm? We're going to have more virtual events. Will the conference industry bounce back? How will the speakers circuit look in a couple of years? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's hard to know. Again, I feel like a lot of conversations I have with people are, especially now that we have vaccines available to one degree or another, that there's this sort of sense of back to normal is just around the corner, and probably not. It's a big wide corner to go around. But I also wonder about some conference businesses that have actually really capitalized on this moment and are in fact starting to build up enough of a business around more frequent, smaller events that people are nevertheless paying for. And then you have the big kind of confabs where you really can bring people together in a new way, because there is a community around the smaller events that then when you bring people together in meet space, they already have some things in common. They've already heard some of the same talks or been involved in some of the same kind of after the show, conversations. They're really interesting tools that I spoke at a kind of closed door conference put on by a company for its clients. I, in fact, did get paid for that speech. And there was use of a tool that I want to say was called Kumo Space afterwards, where there was some conversation and then there were breakout sessions in Zoom also. Those worked really well. And I think the interesting thing there will be the speaker got to talk to the audience and vice versa. Those will be familiar faces next time I see them, whether on a screen or in real life. I think there's some opportunities there to start thinking about what great events can really be. But I think that they will have to be rooted a bit more in a real genuine sense of community, because otherwise the coming together will feel really weird and disorienting because there'll be, so I think there's some interesting kind of redesigns happening. I went to an event in late 2019 where we've decided to kind of resurrect it as a community thing that happens kind of every Friday night, and people give short talks, and like Friday night we got a tour of a food market in Taiwan, because one of the people that participates in this conference lives there, and they have great mobile connectivity, so you could do that on Zoom. But that felt really special and amazing. But the reason that works is we've all had a shared experience in common. To bring it back to Cannes, I have only been to Cannes once. My experience of it was not, this feels like an intimate shared experience where I'm part of a community. That is not the kind of conference Cannes is. So I don't know how Cannes comes back.
No. So a couple things. I agree with Farrah. I think that this has forced non-trade association conferences that do things frequently to actually extend their conference over the entire year. So they're not scrambling every year to start from scratch to get everyone to buy a ticket. You're continuing the conversation. You're showing value. The one point you didn't make, Bob, which I was surprised you made, but for the last 10 months, ad executives, female or male, probably have only had sex with their spouses.
I'm sorry, I forgot to bring that up.
Nobody's talking about that at all. I thought that would be one of the bullet points of the show.
No,
I'm not following that. I'm not following that with a comment. No, I'm leaving that alone. I'm pleading the fifth.
Do you need me to explain it? Because conferences are usually in hotels, and people go to.
Yes, we understand how this works.
Okay. It's true. I hadn't thought about the plight of the Davos girlfriend, but I will give that some more thought now.
Oh, that's a show title, Bob.
Plight of the show, Davos girlfriend. No, I think I've got the title. It's the year-end show, so we'll just go with that like we do every year. I want to move on to another big story from this past year, politics.
Make it easy for us, Bob. Make it easy for us.
Well, I don't want to get into the political ramifications of the election in the U.S. There were many, but I want to focus more on the ancillary stories of how advertising seemed to kind of struggle in the early days. This was a weird election in every way, Joe. I mean, no matter how we slice and dice it, You had the social networks being hammered for the past performance and their current performance in, spreading lies, spreading misinformation. You had TV value being questioned. You had the strategy of like going completely dark during the early days of the pandemic and then suddenly having to come to life at the end. There's so many weird things that are made this an election year like no other in the U.S. What were your impressions?
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple of things. One is I've always, as the guy who back in the day authored Life After the 30-Second Spot, I've always loved being able to parlay or overlay, political advertising on this thesis because, ultimately it's a very binary result in any election. And so one candidate's going to turn around and say, forget about half my advertising is wasted. The problem is I don't know which half. I won. Advertising is awesome. I got a complete 100% return on my investment. And the other one's going to say, what a load of rubbish. I completely wasted all my money because I lost. And then, I interviewed Professor Alan Lichtman on my show. And he's the guy who produced a model that has successfully forecast and predicted the last 10 elections. And one of the things that he actually says is, first of all, the reason why polling doesn't work is because, he didn't say this, but I'm going to say it, is that actually advertising doesn't work because people don't choose the person that they vote for, whether it's for, senator or president, based on their personality or based on messaging up until the election. They base it on their actual performance and their track record. And so, like in many respects, we take a step back and we look, and we look at it from a macro standpoint. And we realize that with all the negative advertising and the deep faking and everything that's wrong with now social networking, which is inextricably part of this whole messaging ecosystem, nothing speaks louder than the ability to actually get the job done or not get the job done in the hearts and minds of people. I will say one other comment, again, from a more of a macro standpoint, is that we demonstrated in this country, where there is no bigger gift and I would say obligation, responsibility than to vote. That there's been tremendous apathy and in the past elections. And this election was incredible in terms of how many people came out and voted. The fact that the loser in this particular case got more votes than any other candidate in history other than the winner in this election demonstrates actually that something, this is the counterpoint to what I'm saying too, that something is working. Now, whether you want to pin that on advertising, I wouldn't. What I would pin it on is the power of communication, of word of mouth, of people feeling that they have a voice, and voting, and putting their, vote where their mouth is. So, for me, when I look back, I see the fact that what was it, guys, like over 150 million people voted. That's got to say something about the fact that at least there was, whether you want to call it engagement or another word, present. Maybe that is hopeful.
Is part of that just that it was a better informed electorate this time, that people were more glued to their television because of the pandemic? They were at home. They had the ability to work and watch TV at the same time, or listen to news, or do the things that they normally couldn't do in the office, that kind of made the election more real for the voting public?
I think part of it is maybe that, but I also think it was more that they were available to be messaged to by organizations that did spring up after 2016 that were really about mobilizing voters. Because, I think Joe is right on a couple of parts of that in particular. And one is that, people do vote on their perception of performance. And what you had is 70 some million people thinking that they really liked the performance of the incumbent, and 75 million people saying, we don't and we want something else. And so I think a lot of it was just infrastructure that had been laid, particularly for the 2018 midterm cycle, and then continued over into 2020 to get people out to vote on both sides. What's interesting is some of the asymmetries of it. So you definitely have the Democratic Party, well, parts of it anyway, really hammering on absentee balloting and early voting, and a real kind of get out the vote strategy. You have and a lot of that happening through digital means, whether that's text banking, phone banking, and social media. On the other side of it, there was still a lot of traditional rallies and door knocking and more traditional get out the vote operations. And also there's sort of loss aversion. The people who like how things were going didn't want to lose that, so they were motivated to go and vote. But I think a lot of what you had was, frankly, availability to vote. When you have a whole lot of people who don't have to be in an office on a Tuesday, they can go stand in line in Philadelphia to vote. That and whether that's because they are working from home or because they've been furloughed, that availability is an interesting component of it as well. But the thing I'll depart from maybe in the question there, Bob, is whether they were better informed. That's a tricky word. I think informed about how to vote, yes. And Joe and
that's what I meant. I mean, it's just like, obviously they're not informed, but better informed about their opinions. Like feeling like they had a better grip on what the candidate stood for.
Yeah, I mean, I was listening to a really great interview with Jan Seltzer, who does the Seltzer poll in Iowa and is the one who predicted Obama sweeping the Iowa caucuses back in 2008 and has been very successful in predicting the outcome in Iowa over the years. But one of the things she talked about is that there's kind of a weird shallowness of understanding of, for instance, the Trump voter. But I suspect she'd probably find similar things on the other side if she were doing focus groups with those folks too, of you get them into a room, they say they're not so sure they're going to vote for Trump the second time around. You ask, well, okay, so are you going to vote for Trump? I don't know. Is there another Republican you'd like to vote for? I can't think of anybody. Literally can't come up with a name. There isn't another brand Republican that they can conjure to think about voting for. And then and of course he was running unopposed effectively too. So this was kind of a trick question. And then, well, what about a Democrat? Would you vote for a Democrat? No, God, no, never in a million years. All right. So what has he done well? Well, I like the wall and I like the China policy and I like this and I like that. So yes, they're happy with how things are going. Can you guys hear me?
Oh, I can hear you fine. I'm not sure what was going on with Joe.
Looks like Joe maybe lost the sound. But so that I think is an interesting thing that you are starting to see in the social science, which is that really it's kind of team affiliation. That's pretty well established. The number of independents this time around seemed to be fewer. And so everybody kind of knew what team they were on. And then the question is just not who am I going to vote for, but will I vote? So I think the real interesting thing this year was two very different strategies for getting out the vote that seemed to work pretty well for each of their constituencies. And I think being at home helped.
Yeah, being at home definitely helped.
But... Well, you know what's so interesting is you have this unbelievable storyline about manual, analog, hanging chads, right? In person, the old way. I mean, it's almost it's a story of all of our lives as marketers, as fighters and advocates for innovation. And then you've got the whole move towards technology, or the use and incorporation of technology, to me, culminating to the point where there absolutely should be the ability to vote securely on a mobile device. I mean, that's really what it's got to come down to. Just like you get an alert on your phone that says there's a tornado bearing down or some kind of Amber Alert, and just quite frankly, the same that your mobile phone should be contact tracing and helping you on that regard. And so for me, I think that's where we need to get to when we think about voter suppression, when we think about being able to, to Farrah's very, very cogent point, I just stole a word from Samuel there, about the fact that what are we going to do in 4 years' time when everyone's back at work and bosses won't let you leave and whatever the case may be? We've all got this thing called a smartphone. Why on earth are we not using that smartphone?
Well, that gets into a weird,
register that vote?
That gets into a whole other weird gray area because of the fact that, I mean, right now we're sitting on top of a huge Russian hack of our entire infrastructure.
Yes, of course. Exactly.
So, I mean, so,
by the way,
voting
but Bob, let me just say, but Bob, that point though that you just made is exactly is equally valid and relevant to all of the misinformation and the confusion through social networks.
Right, but I'm just saying that solving this problem is not based on having the ability to vote via a mobile phone, because then you don't have a paper ballot to kind of back up that vote. But I think the bigger story here that you're kind of touching on, Joe, is the fact that we employed all kinds of interesting new strategies to get the vote out. And I think that was the big success story of advertising and marketing and vote getting and door knocking and meme strategies and, video game efforts. I mean, people doing things via Animal Crossing. It was all about getting the vote out. It was about touching audiences that were feeling disenfranchised, not part of the process, and bringing them into the fold and getting them to be feeling like part of the voting process again. That's why we had such a huge turnout. And what do you guys think about that? I mean, I'm
going to play devil's advocate, because if you look at the media companies and the creative agencies, the shed load of money spent on political ads this year and the amount of money being reported going into Georgia is crazy. And if you like me were at home and saw a lot of these ads which had zero creativity and haven't evolved in the last 30 years, you could argue that advertising does work, because the amount of money spent and the turnout. If I'm selling if I'm in the political ad space, I'm saying, oh look, the highest number of people voted ever, and we spent the most money ever. Ta-da! Advertising does work. Thank you. Can I have sign me up for another 4 years? So, in terms of
that's not my point, though, Sam. I mean, I want to clarify just before you go on. I mean, my point is that we spent a lot of money on advertising the candidates, but I think that did less to get people out to vote than the effort of saying your vote matters and the voting, the get out the vote effort specifically for, just you exercising your right to vote, not voting for any particular candidate. There's these nonprofit efforts to get the vote out. That was the big success story.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing there, though, is that you have these differences of opinion about whether, about messaging strategies within that. And so one, like you're saying, Bob, I think there's a lot of success in, we don't have to worry too much about which candidate you're going to support. If I'm calling you, I'm on one side of the aisle or another, and I know that you are too. So all I'm really doing is making sure you feel valued and important, and that there is an urgency behind your participation in this election. On the other hand, you do have some people who are a little bit harder to motivate, and so they do need some reason to vote beyond you really want my vote. And that's where you do have some interesting kind of infighting, I guess, on both sides, really, about whether to wage political warfare on the national stage or on the local one when we're talking about non-presidential races. Do we talk about, like right after the election, there was a call where some of the, contents of that call were leaked to the press, where Abigail Spanberger apparently got upset to the point of tears, talking about how she felt that AOC and the progressive side of the party were doing a lot of damage, talking about Black Lives Matter and Medicare for all and defund the police, and that, we should just be talking about healthcare all the time. On the other hand, you had some really successful, candidates on both sides in this election and in the midterms who ran on things like, frankly, traffic signals and the condition of the roads and basic infrastructure and local stuff. And that also works really well. Yeah, potholes. Yes. I told a story to Joe the other day about the first time I ever did political focus groups. They were with independents in the collar counties of Philadelphia. I opened the focus group by saying, how's everybody doing? And people someone in each group yelled out potholes. literally just yelled out potholes. And part of it was like March or April in Philadelphia after the snows and the roads are in bad condition. Part of it is they knew they were there for focus groups.
Having grown up in Philadelphia, I can vouch for the potholes. There are lots of potholes.
I would have stood in Philadelphia for potholes and garbage collection this year, and I think I would certainly have been would won with a landslide, because those were the two biggest issues going on during the pandemic in Philadelphia, was the lack of the incompetent garbage pickup situation that the mayor was suffering. And I think I would have won landslide. And I was being a bit, I think over the top talking about how advertising does work. But I think this year has also proven how ineffective and how inefficient a lot of stuff is. The amount of texts and messaging I got to make sure to get out the vote was so extreme that I must have got like 225 messages continuously from people pre, during, and post the election about it. So I think I'm looking forward to the analysis in the next 6 months that comes out and actually identifies what did or didn't work. Certainly more money was put in, and there's no disincentive to put more money into it in the future. But I'm not so sure that us as voters or consumers, if you want to put it in that, were appreciative of how much we were being targeted and how much we were being messaged and how much things were all about politics. And I know it's really important, but it was interesting that I'm sure there was a tipping point and an overload point. So we'll see. I'm looking forward to the analysis to give us some facts and how we can be better going forward.
By the way, I was responsible for 220 of those 225 text messages to you, Sam. But I actually I phone banked maybe 7 or 8 times. I did it fairly regularly, maybe more. And just a couple of interesting reflections. Obviously, text messaging was one way to do it. But using a piece of software and essentially, hopefully not cold calling, but in many cases doing that through kind of warmer databases as well. You can't underplay the importance of Zoom through the process, because Zoom played a significant role in terms of training and in terms of facilitating these sessions. And I think, and I think Farrah's point is very, very important, which is you cannot separate the fact that so much of this happened in a year. Just like you can't take COVID out of it, just like you can't take the controversy surrounding the politics out of it, a very polarizing, clearly a very polarizing incumbent. You also can't take up the context that people were at home. And by the way, becoming much more comfortable at using virtual conferencing type of tools like Zoom.
That's a subject unto itself. That's a subject unto itself, and it's probably a good segue into the next set of topics. But I want to talk about Zoom just a little bit before we move on, because Zoom affected everything. I mean, it affected just about everything. It affected the way that we socialized. It affected the way we worked. It affected the way that we dealt with politics. It was just such a massive input into this time where we're staying at home. Farrah, I'm sorry I cut you off before, and I wasn't sure if you got a chance to finish, but would you like to, comment on Zoom or anything else that you were going to say?
Yeah, well, I think it's related in one way to what we were also just talking about, which is, Zoom for training, Zoom for fundraising events. There were events for I think the Biden campaign that involved like the cast of Hamilton. And when you went to watch it, which I did, it was over my head. I am not enough of a musical theater nerd to know what the heck they were talking about most of the time in that Zoom call. But my friends who come from musical theater were thrilled and completely over the moon about it. And then it's like, oh, and by the way, you want to be in the room where it happens. Here's a montage of people voting at mailboxes. And I think they were actually really effective. I think it was fine as a fundraising kind of mechanism, and it seemed to work. They had lots of those events. They could do more of them because you don't have to get all the celebrities together in one place. They were more affordable. Some of them were kind of donation optional. So people got to feel like they were part of something. And I think that was reasonably effective. But I think there's another side of this, which some of the pollsters are starting to talk about as well, which is that, frankly, the people who are able to work from home tend to be people who work in jobs where or live in places where, first of all, there were work from home, stay-at-home orders. So they were taking the virus seriously early on. They were they were trying to, they were trying to observe good COVID hygiene, all that sort of thing. Those people tended to be Democrats. So pollsters had some polling error that seems to have been driven by people who have access to technology like Zoom, who are home all day working, or are able to afford to be on a furlough, or at the very least live in places that are taking it seriously. I think that confluence of technology and culture is really interesting and has some effects on how you approach messaging, how you approach polling, how you approach political advertising. AOC's theory of the case is digital and social all the way. She had a very successful Twitch stream playing Among Us. And then you have the kind of centrists who go, no, TV is still the thing. TV and events and knocking on doors are still the thing. So there's some interesting skews that happen, I think, when we start to introduce this sort of technology angle. Not everybody was on Zoom all year. That was something a lot of us experienced, but then a lot of people were not experiencing that at all. So that's just my technology not evenly distributed argument.
You're pointing out a macro trend that I think is, as you say, true for some of us and not true for others of us, probably skewing along age groups. So what we're looking at is a macro trend that's going to be happening over the next couple of decades, where we are going to move more to a virtual type interaction scenario with people, that we are going to feel more comfortable with it. Now, that doesn't mean that in-person goes away, obviously, but
right.
It does mean that the society as a whole is getting more comfortable with digital communication.
Exactly. Even in my practice, it is easier and easier every year to get people to do digital diaries, to follow your instructions about how to set up their webcam so that you can see them, and set up their laptops or their microphones so you can hear them. They're more willing to be kind of candid and creative and, sort of stream of consciousness freewheeling. And you're seeing a willingness, at least, to try it across age groups, but levels of comfort obviously vary with the technology. But just like it was a really great year for recruiting. There were a lot of people who had the time and could use the extra $100. And so that is another thing that I think Zoom helped enable. It was a lot easier to talk to people this year than it's ever been.
Well, sidebar comment, as I was listening there, one thing that it's becoming more apparent is how we as marketers, as advertisers, as communicators, as researchers, as recruiters use the technology in an additive way. I think there's so many bad experiences and lame experiences of Zoom and the technology being used. And one of the things I've certainly seen is the ability to do more storytelling, to do more human engaging and be more creative, and not just take your lame 3-hour meeting or your lame 2-day conference and just make it, put it on video and bore everyone to death with that way. And so I think there is more opportunity to be more human, to be more creative, to use more storytelling, to use more informal, to do more, to have more fun even. So the inclusion of gamification and more just interactive elements of a lot of the work I do is literally just being more interactive, being more collaborative. And there's schools of thought that says you can't be innovative, or you can't be engaging, or you can't connect digitally. But I think that there's a lot of competence to do that. And just linking back to an earlier point, I think for me, the true test of a great speaker or a presenter or a great conference is, are they just as lame on the virtual version? And I've seen some great presenters, some great speakers who've actually embraced the technology and done a great job. But equally, I think a lot of forums have struggled to do it digitally because they haven't had the talent, and they haven't really constructed an interaction that is human centric. So for me, again, 2021 is going to be hugely, there's a huge opportunity of blending the two, because when the vaccine's rolled out, we are going to connect and meet in person. But now there's so much more opportunity to do non-linear engagement, non-linear research, non-linear communication, where you use digital as part of the touch point and part of the journey, and not just be all and end all. So I'm excited because I think there's a lot of great platforms, lots of great technology. Audio podcasting is just, I think, growing because, again, that's a digital form that is connecting with people. So I'm excited for 2021 as we include the technology in a smart way.
Well, that's the good side of tech. Now let's move to the bad side of tech, because that was another big story from 2020. It kind of rolled in from 2019, which rolled in from 2018, but it's getting more and more likely that big tech is going to be broken up, or at least the government's going to try to go after big tech.
And I voted already on that.
Well, every single week we dealt with something to do with, tech behaving badly, big tech behaving badly. Big tech needs to give back more. Jeff Bezos needs to fund, recovery efforts with all his billions of dollars. Facebook, we had that big boycott. We have the Google suit ramping up right now. Saul, I'm going to start with you on this one. What do you think about the state of big tech and what is likely to happen going forward? Are we going to see a breakup of big tech? Is that going to happen, or is this just going to be mired in the courts until some decision, a relevant decision, is made, like with the Microsoft suit, where Microsoft basically outweighed them and then became irrelevant in a lot of ways that they were being accused of being monopolistic about?
So to quote the great Joseph Jaffe, I'm going to sound like Saul Colt here when I say this may not be a very popular. Really? Yeah, this may be a controversial decision. I was on the show. You honored me by having me on a guest when we talked about this maybe a month or two ago and we talked about Microsoft. So I want to take it in a little bit of a different direction. Then you guys can all pile on. For the most part, I don't think people are that outraged by big tech because, at least in the short term, the consumer sometimes wins. It's hard to say what happens in the long term because nobody really knows. But, taking Microsoft aside, most people remember the story about Amazon and Quidsy. Do you guys remember the whole diapers.com thing? Yeah. There was these two guys who bought diapers.com and soap.com, and they had a diaper and soap subscription service that went crazy and took off. And because it went crazy and took off, Amazon wanted to buy them, and they didn't want to sell to Amazon. So what Amazon basically did was they dropped their prices 50% on diapers and other baby products. And the rumor was that they were losing about $100 million over 3 months just to own that category. And eventually the Quidsby ended up selling to them. They got, just destroyed and didn't get any value for it. And Amazon won in the long term. But not only did Amazon win, they basically bought that market, and all these people who are buying diapers and all these people who are buying baby products now only buy them from Amazon because Amazon was giving them away, like 30% under cost. And slowly they raised the prices and slowly they did it. But Amazon's able to do that. When I think of the tracking and all those things that Facebook does, and Google knowing everything about you, and many years ago there was that story about Target basically being the one to inform a woman she was pregnant based on her like snacking buying and their data research. There is no real outrage. There was that documentary called The Social Dilemma that outlined all of this stuff, and nobody talked about it because either people don't know, they're not paying attention, or they don't care. So is this a problem? Absolutely. Should the public be running around with pitchforks and flaming torches? They probably should, but nobody is. So where does that leave us? And I don't have the answer for this.
My question to you that I want to kind of expand on is, the public may not care about it, but obviously government cares about it. And I'm wondering, does the government have enough will to go after them for the benefit of the public, even if the public doesn't want to go for it?
Well, do they have the will? Probably not. What is the punishment going to be? So let's say they win this fight with Facebook. So they'll break up Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram, and there'll be 3 separate companies. Maybe they don't share data. Maybe there's just more money going back and forth between them, and there'll be an enormous fine. I don't remember exactly which case we were talking about many months ago, but we talked about how the fine, the fine that would be levied towards Facebook was probably the equivalent of 6 or 7 days worth of profit. So, there's nothing that can actually punish these people financially that would make any blip on their financial radar. It's like a rounding error. And as far as separating the businesses, they still own the businesses. They're still operating. They can still do everything they could do, unless they literally shut someone down, which I don't believe that they're legally entitled to. I could be wrong about that. I don't see anything other than just like money just changing hands and cash grabs and all sorts of things. Like maybe I'm just being pessimistic about it. I think I'm being a pragmatist about it, looking in the reality, but I just don't actually see what the government could do to affect change, except for them writing a big check, which doesn't hurt them.
I think that's a very North American perspective. I'd put money on the Europeans will solve it, and the rest of the world will catch up. Because there was a piece that from 21st of December, Facebook messaging apps fall under their e-privacy directive, so they turned off interactive options on Messenger until they could get it to fit in. I'm thinking, no. There's no way that Facebook turns stuff off before they have to, unless there's something shady happening that is about to be exposed. And so with all the so there's for me, there's two parts. There's the legal stuff, which is going to happen in Europe because they're constantly being sued, they're constantly being fined, and the European Union are just going to forcibly break them up and make them pay tax in the next 2 to 4 years, whether they like it or not, and make them sell stuff to other people, and they're going to impose it. And then I think the trust erosion that's going to happen, because with all the Cambridge Analytica and more revelations that have happened, especially with Facebooks of this world, and I mentioned the Tim Gebru example of the AI researcher who's basically kicked out, but then there's an internal mutiny. Facebook staff have been mutineering all year. The black Facebook employees every year write an article about how they're disenfranchised, and so the internal issues that they have. So these companies are, I know a lot of people who work at these places, and I love those people, but I just feel that certainly in Europe, the legality is going to happen, and I think the brand trust erosion is going to impact them financially, and there's going to be other products which are going to come to the marketplace. But ultimately, governments will take action to A, get compensation by taxing them more and getting paid, and B, I'm certain that European Union countries will ultimately ban it. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if some of the Nordic companies just said, okay, get out, go, you're kicked out, and for the greater good. So I'm optimistic that is the only power that will then come to the North America to balance things out, because Zuckerberg, Sundar, Jeff, they're not changing how they behave and how they operate, even if despite internal and external pressure. And I think Europe will role model how that will be for the greater good.
I think the other thing to keep in mind in the U.S., and I completely agree with what you just said, Sam, GDPR actually does have some penalties that genuinely hurt businesses. And so Europe is clearly more willing to do that sort of thing than the U.S. is. But that being said, there are these suits. There are these investigations. There are these calls coming from members of Congress to break up these companies. I agree with Saul that this is not exactly coming from consumers, but that's actually how antitrust works. we couch it in the language of what is of benefit to the customer, but really that is defined by one fact and one fact only, and that's price. If you're talking about Facebook, the customer pays nothing to be on Facebook. So who will bring the antitrust action against Facebook? It will be competitors or would-be competitors to Facebook. The people who are whispering in the ears of legislators are not, there are some consumer advocacy groups, certainly, but it's not like individual constituents calling up Elizabeth Warren to complain about Facebook. It's competitors to Facebook. It's telecom companies who are saying, hey, you know what? We're not allowed to do that stuff because we're regulated. It's other tech companies. It's Apple. There are a lot of other businesses and industries and trade groups and lobbyists who are talking to members of Congress about why these companies are too damn big. And I think the interesting thing about that is that you have that side of it. Then you have the PR risks, the reputational risk of your employees walk out at Google. Google fires their AI ethicist and thinks that that's cool in this day and age. Those things are actual problems for those companies because reputational risk is like the lead indicator for actual regulatory risk. Like if we're getting slammed in the media constantly, eventually members of Congress will figure out what those articles are saying and call us in for real hearings and have real action. So you want to start to get ahead of it. Apple deciding to cut for some app makers the commission that they charge on apps in the App Store. Amazon, lots of people are predicting that 2021 is the year AWS gets spun off from Amazon. which is easy to do because they are truly separate businesses, and it will be to the benefit of shareholders and Jeff Bezos for sure to do that. Just two of the world's biggest businesses now, as opposed to one of the world's biggest businesses. That will be very easy. Facebook, it's less clear how you disentangle all of these apps, and I'm not sure it will come. The antitrust arguments being put forward are interesting, but I don't know that under like the current kind of precedent they work particularly well, just because of the free issue. And so it'll be interesting to see what other arguments come forward for regulating them in interesting ways.
Well, Farrah,
but it's not going to come from the grassroots. That's just not how antitrust works. Farrah, it's not really about consumer advocacy at all.
I want to continue with you for just a second, because one of the elements that's been brought up in a lot of the stories about the antitrust component of these attacks against big tech is that the customers are actually the advertisers, and that advertisers are really being hurt by the monopoly or the duopoly. So is that a valid way to look at the antitrust legislation, is maybe having a little bit more legs than it would have if it was just for consumers?
Absolutely. And that's why you see things like in the battle over the App Store Commission, Epic Games they did this on purpose, right? They created two price points. If you bought stuff through Epic Games, then you paid less than if you bought things through the Apple payment system. And that was to meet the standards of the existing precedent about cost to the consumer. To your point, Bob, I think that is exactly right. It will be the small businesses. It's also, again, an easier argument against somebody like Amazon, where the advertisers are also competing directly with Amazon. But in the Facebook universe, there's only two big players for online advertising. The lack of choice is the flip side of the lack of competition argument. And so it's hard for brands or businesses to compete on efficiencies around their marketing dollars if there's only two games in town and they both charge the same amount, for example. So that's a separate area of antitrust law, but it is the more interesting one in that circumstance because, to your point, the only real customers of Facebook and Google services are advertisers. Literally, we sell ads, Senator. So that's the that is where the interesting arguments come from. But there are also arguments being made, particularly against Facebook, that are kind of related to fraud stuff with respect to consumer protection. And they're interesting arguments. Some circuit court will be persuaded. Whether the Supreme Court will be is kind of doubtful to me. But
and by the way, that message, we sell ads, Senator, that is the central takeaway from the social dilemma, that actually at the root of all of this evil is advertising. But I want to build on what you guys were saying. First of all, props to Sam, who's clearly on first name basis with all of these leaders. He speaks about Jeff and Sundar, and so that's impressive.
Just like Beyonce and Oprah, they only need one name.
I'm telling you, like Jeff, right? But as Bill Maher would say, I don't know this for a fact, I just know it's true. The actual phrase big tech, if you trace the origins of big tech, that is a campaign talking point that has been squarely focused right now on the current administration as a way of being able to kind of cry foul. And why do I bring it up? Not for political purposes, but in a way, what it's done is it's created the spotlight on these companies. And it's exposed everything that we've discussed, right? From an antitrust standpoint, from a privacy standpoint. Wendy Cooper, a friend of the BeanCast, would have a thing or two to say about what Amazon has done to merchants and small businesses and how it's just literally pulverized them. So there are many factors that are in play. And the reality is that these companies, these big four or big five, they're either victims of their own success. They are proof positive about their own power. But the reality is, just like every other company, they're too big. They're just too big, and it just doesn't work. And so whether it's their fault or no fault of their own, something's got to give, and it's going to give.
Well, one of the interesting things about the big tech phenomenon, the FANG, if you will, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, and Google, is the fact that Apple in that scenario is trying to do a little bit, take a different stance than the rest of them. I mean, it's trying its best, or at least positioning itself as trying its best to protect user privacy. And one of the moves that they made this year was that they announced iOS 14 and that it would take away IDFA tags, or IDs for Facebook advertising tags. If I'm not mistaken, that's what it's dealing with.
It's just ID for advertisers.
ID for advertisers. That's what I was trying to say. I totally screwed that up. Anyway, ID for advertiser tags. That caused a big sensation throughout the advertising industry. The marketing world was thrown into disarray. Facebook particularly got upset with it. That's why I messed up on that IDFA tag thing. But Facebook,
they took out the big the full page ad, right? So they tried to buy it.
They got really upset about it, and so many of the advertising industry kind of rebelled against this that Apple said, we're going to give you more time to implement it, but they're still planning on doing it in 2021. Farrah, is this a good move for them? Was this a solid move for them? Is it a smart move for them? Does it really solidify their position in the face of all this break up the companies type rhetoric going on in Washington? Does it position them in a better way with their customers? What do you think about it?
I think it works for them in a few directions. I do think it makes it harder. Like when you look at, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Google, of the four, the kind of easiest to go, but are they really like the others, is Apple. And that's both because they're not really in the content or advertising business, and also because of the position that they've taken on user privacy. I think that insulates them from some of the places where they should be in trouble, which is the amount of money that they take off of app developers, and also the fact that they basically don't allow any other payment systems through apps on their phone. So when you look at those things, like they're already trying to get ahead of some of those controversies, and I think it helps them with that. I also think it continues to be a differentiator, I suppose, for certain kinds of customers who just feel like Apple is a trustworthy technology partner. Which is building on a much older legacy of that was in some respects born of having a small market share, that you're less likely to have malware and that sort of thing on an Apple computer than on a PC. So I think it runs to their benefit from a PR point of view, and also just from a brand benefit point of view. I do think that consumer movements take a while to get off the ground, and 10 years ago, the kind of argument of nobody cares about privacy seemed really true. I think the adoption of ad blockers, the adoption of browsers that offer them, the fact that people do feel that it's getting creepier and creepier, discussions about on places like Facebook and Google whether micro-targeting should even be allowed for, in particular, political advertising. I think those conversations are representing the start of the snowball, and Apple will just be in a good position by being way ahead of it, by effectively saying, we're not really that interested in surveillance capitalism. We sell great hardware and mediocre services.
Well, I think the bigger question.
Take a different approach.
Okay, I'll let you go.
That I agree with everything you said to a point, to Apple wanting to remove themselves from the conversation. But, as something I've said before, Apple sells great hardware, but there's only so many SKUs, and people are actually buying less and less of the cycle of upgrading their phone is getting longer and longer and longer. Apple, by removing themselves from the situation, they'll let Amazon and Facebook and Google cannibalize themselves with all of the attention and the privacy and everything. And, one of the great things that I've always admired by, these guys who call themselves futurists, and women too, they make these bold predictions 3-4 years out, and nobody ever looks back to see if they're right. So I'm going to make a bold prediction and say by 2024, Apple's going to say, hey, we're the only ones with the data to track everybody. So bring all your advertising dollars here, and let's relaunch iAd or whatever it was called, 5-6 years ago, because they do want to remove themselves from the situation, but they are going to see see that, to keep shareholders happy and to keep things, they can't just keep shortening that window of a new phone or a new MacBook. They are going to have to come up with other things, and owning data is the true commerce in the world, and they're going to be the ones who have it.
Let me pose. One second. I'm going to go to you, Sam. I am going to go to you next on this. But what I want to ask the question of is all this kind of machinations around data and around understanding who the customer is to a micro-targeted level, is it all just smoke and mirrors in the end? I get the feeling, and I think a lot of people in the tech industry are starting to get the feeling that even though we have all this information on the customer, and even though we're able to drill down, and even though we're able to micro-target to a certain amount, especially when we're talking about political advertising or political messaging, in the end, people have already made their choices and they're just gravitating around information that they already agree with. So is it really necessary? And will we suddenly find out when these tags are removed that advertising is still equally effective? Sam?
I mean, I go ahead, Sam.
Well, I was I'll pick up that and say, Saul made some good points, although last time I checked, maybe I'm wrong now, that Apple's the most valuable company in the world in terms of market capitalization. So they probably won't sneak away from their accountability and responsibility, saying, hey, we're not like those guys. We're not as bad as those, because, yeah, but you're the biggest of all of them. So I don't think that excuse is going to work for Apple eventually. And I think Saul's sort of projection, there is truth behind it, right? So Apple's got their walled garden. They're going to set the standard. Everyone else is screwed, and then they're the people with the most data. And hang on a minute, you duped us into believing you, but actually now you have exactly the same power. Why should we trust you any more than trusting the others? And so I think this privacy, as I don't know, the world is changing. And so as you talked about futurists, I think Saul talked about them, and I know Joe's written books about this, right? In terms of the value exchange. So more and more going forward, there is going to be an equalization of who gets the money from the data that I have, and also my rights to privacy and anonymity, or my rights to be compensated for that value being used, because these companies are making shed loads of money from information, whether they have it personally identifiable or not. I don't even believe them anymore. All of this nonsense that no one has personally identifiable data, I actually don't buy it. You have too many indicators, too much context, too much capability so you actually do know it's me, especially with all of this stuff during COVID of, oh yes, we can see where infection rates are going up or down based on people's movements and all this. I'm thinking, I don't like it. And all of these hacks being had. So I think the privacy will increase in importance from an individual consumer basis. And I think the companies will be held more accountable. And ultimately, the system will move where I'm actually getting a check at the end of the year or every quarter for my data and my information being used, and that will become the new norm. And then the other point I just wanted to make about all the privacy is that this brand safety space is actually growing, and there's been a lot of work being done. And I know Sleeping Giants was in that space of sort of holding companies and brands liable or holding them to check. But there's this work, Nandini Jami, the former co-founder of Sleeping Giants, he's founded this Check My Ads platform. It's all about brand safety and how to separate yourself from disinformation and hate speech and all these negative impacts. So I think there are certainly the brand marketers and advertisers are becoming more conscious of how they're perceived. So the reputation impact is not only on the big tech companies, but on the brands and the companies who are inappropriately using data or inappropriately communicating, connecting. So I think that the bar will be raised by legislation, but also of the brands and the companies being more thoughtful and more proactive. But
my question though is, will advertising be less effective? I mean, will we find, like, you're talking about brand safety, and yeah, there's a lot of danger in having so much data, and targeting people in that way. I mean, but I'm wondering, will advertising be less effective without these tags? Has
there been any persuasive evidence that it's really been more effective? I mean, I want to say this. I think the idea about all of this data being collected and therefore used, those are not necessary conditions of one another. The data is being collected. And I think, the thing that you were saying, Sam, like, yes, 4 points of data is all that's required to identify an individual at the individual level, but it's enough more incremental work to do that the brands that hold the data aren't the ones doing it. It's right now researchers mostly, and then also hackers. So the data being collected on its own is problematic. And I do think there will be more legislation all over the U.S., like the CCPA and the new privacy one that just got passed in November in California, that look kind of like GDPR, and it will roll it out piecemeal because we're America. But eventually there will be more regulation on the data collection. And I think it will actually come as a huge relief to the companies who feel like they can't compete with Facebook, they can't compete with Google, they can't compete with Amazon on the amount of data they collect, because no one will be able to collect that much data. And I don't actually buy that it will make advertising less effective, because I'm not totally convinced that after I've already bought a sofa, you following me around advertising me the exact same damn sofa is so effective. I mean, like, the ability of these companies to actually weaponize the data seems to me to be constantly overstated compared to what they're actually doing. And so what they're really doing is building these enormous data lakes open to hackers, open to bad use, and not really being able to do what they would like to be able to do with them. And they could come up with all kinds of new technology, differential privacy, and all the rest of it to get around these problems, or they could just wash their hands of it. And I think there's something interesting in Apple kind of signaling that there is a way to wash your hands of it and still have a perfectly thriving business. The other way to use data is not to sell advertising, but to sell subscription services. Netflix proves that. Apple is proving that. Other services are proving that too. So you don't actually have to have this ad-backed model to make money off your user data. And you can collect a whole hell of a lot less data that's less vulnerable to hacks and personal identification. Right. And I think safety can be had all around in a world where we're not thinking that the only thing that matters is more data collected.
And I just want to give maybe a little bit of a kind of theoretical, historical backdrop to this, which is when you look at the original roles and the classic roles for advertising, they are three: to inform, to persuade, and to remind. And when we talk about informing in particular, and then across the journey, right? There is this idea of the right message in front of the right person in the right place at the right time. The right place and the right time has never, ever been delivered on, until two pieces of mobile technology. One is called the car, and now this connected car, and the other one is the smartphone in particular. And guess what? The smartphone sits in the car as well. And so, what we've been doing a fairly creepy and poor job on is somebody goes to AA.com to look at fares to San Francisco flying. For those people that don't remember, flying is what we used to do before the pandemic, and they don't check out, or they don't complete, and then the next thing they know, they're being completely inundated on Instagram and Facebook with there's still time to finish your booking to San Francisco. And so that's the remind part, and that's kind of a bit lazy, and it's a little bit irritating. But there's merit to be able to kind of go the frequency and repetitive route. But I think it's the right place and the right time that is the bigger play. And we're still, I think, just scratching the surface at being able to take care of this always on or connectedness. And the car is going to play a huge role in that, and of course the phone as well. And I think when we start to see that, that's when that R word, relevance, starts to play a more significant role for us. And that's when consumers can figure out maybe perhaps a better trade-off in terms of the fact this was actually quite useful and helpful to me.
Well, we got to pick up the pace and go on to our next topic at this point. One of the big things that happened during the pandemic was that the streaming battles that we were long promised, that people talked about coming up real soon, got really real during this time. I mean, there were stories about, you had streaming services every week launching. I mean, of course, you had Quibi launch and then fold less than a year later. You had Peacock launch. You had Discovery announced that they're doing their network. You had HBO Max really ramping up. You had movies abandoning theaters. There's so many different ways to take this story, Saul. This is a real different. This is a different time overall because of streaming. Streaming is disrupting everything because so many people have adopted it. People feel more comfortable downloading movies and watching them at home now because they don't want to go to theaters. And that's going to continue into 2021 because Time Warner has said that they're going to be launching all their theatrical releases day and date on HBO Max for no additional money. I mean, you had Disney Plus doing the same with their initial releases. What do you think? I mean, what's going on in the streaming area?
So I could literally talk for an hour on this topic because it's something that I'm passionate about and very curious about. I know we don't have that much left, so I'm going to hit a couple of the points and let other people jump in. But here's what we learned from the past year in the streaming wars. Netflix is still the king with 195 million subscriptions and really the pioneer of the original content and not just showing libraries of nostalgic shows. And I think that's part of, why they're still the king. Disney and Warner are behind, but they're growing fast. And like you said, with the day and date, Wonder Woman 84 and things like that, people are spending a lot more attention and they'll continue to grow. But the big learning, at least in my opinion, for 2020 is I think streaming is going to get more expensive. The fact that, they're charging extra for a lot of these first run movies and stuff like that. Cable is going to continue to suffer and probably its demise has been accelerated by 10 years or more. Reality TV is here to stay. Some of the most popular shows on streaming this year have all been reality based. And the big thing that I think came from this, and I realize I'm sort of focusing on a small subset of the entire topic, but intellectual property is more important than ever. When you look at things like Star Wars and Marvel at Disney, the shares, the stock went up like crazy the day they announced that there was 15 Marvel TV shows and 6 more Star Wars properties going directly to Disney Plus, and all the way down to Saved by the Bell at Peacock. Almost all of these streaming networks need to own some intellectual property to either use as a launch or as a retaining, apparatus for their streaming, because there are so many. They all cost money. People are probably have a pretty wide net right now, but I do think in the next year people are going to stream down and say, okay, I tend to watch these 3. I don't need 5. I don't need 6. I could live without Discovery Plus and just watch 90 Day Fiance and on YouTube or whatever. So I do think that there's it's exploded. It's going to narrow. People are going to figure out what they want to pay for or not want to pay for. And but it is here to stay for sure.
You are 100% correct, and I think the challenge is going to be. It's really going to come down to one word, and that's value. And you've seen some short-term greed. There's a massive land grab, but then there've been some surprising lights. And exceptions to the norm. For example, Hamilton on Disney, and suddenly I was like, well, how much am I going to pay for it? Another $40 or $50, which I would. And then I was like, wait a second, it's free. Wonder Woman, WW84, I think, on Christmas Day, free. And so on one hand, people are going to start to make those comparisons and factor those into the pricing. On the other hand, there are, when you speak about IP, Saul, I'd only add it's IP and partnerships because, as it relates to IP, the only reason why I eventually succumbed and subscribed to CBS All Access is not because of Picard or Star Trek, as much as I'm a fan of the franchise. It's because they're showing Europa games and Champions League. And I'm a huge English football fan, or just football fan in general. And so, but you're absolutely right. The cable companies are going to suffer big time. And of course, the movies, cinema. What the hell is cinema going to look like in 2021?
Well, this is the Uberification of the movie industry, and basically these companies have decided, sorry guys, it's your time to lose, and we're going to flex our muscles with the upstream vertical integration of owning the content and the distribution. I mean, this is like classic business 101. If Harvard's going to be able to teach this in the future, in terms of this vertical integration of owning the content and the distribution, it used to be cinemas, and it used to be TV or cable companies, and now that's been completely disrupted. And just on a very personal level, Joe, you probably need some tips from me. I should create some sort of blog post of how to get stuff for free, because currently I've got Apple TV for free. I've got HBO Max free with my phone plan. I've got Prime Video free with signing up for Amazon, and I get Peacock free with my Xfinity subscription. So those are actually all free. And tactically, I bought Disney halfway through Mandalorian so I could batch watch it and only pay $7 and not actually subscribe. CBS All Access, I've managed to consistently get the free 1 month trial and never actually pay for that. So Netflix is basically the only thing which is always getting the money out of my household. And I say all that to say, look, this is like a full-time job for me to manage my skullduggery and my ability to get the content I want, because these buggers are actually delivering great content across these freaking platforms.
I see a viral post, Sam.
Well, I know, I've got the post, but I just like analyzing my own behavior. It was like, what is wrong with me? I am the coupons cutter version of the free streaming network, because I need this stuff. I mean, Ted Lasso and Apple, HBO Max is, I just watched Aquafina in Nora from Queens, which is awesome. Prime has got some good stuff. Peacock is for the football or the soccer. And as I've said, Mandalorian on Disney, and Star Trek stuff on CBS. And I'm thinking, so there is the beauty of all this is the creativity matters and the content is king. And I think that ultimately they're going to find a way to charge me for more of the stuff, and I'll probably begrudgingly pay. And so there is value. So if you're for me, I'm seeing it from if you're a shareholder by these brands, and if you're a creator, there's a huge opportunity. And if you're a creative person, how might you come into new partnerships and own your rights and own your content, partnering with these companies in these new deals? So I absolutely see it to be the future. I watch stuff on my TV, then move to my iPad, and then my phone. If I'm watching a soccer game, I will be in three different rooms seamlessly. So the tech works, the content works, and I see a huge opportunity for them to monetize this. And especially during COVID, I think this is the one joy that a lot of people have had is watching this content. So as much as I moaned and bitched about the tech companies earlier, I see that especially the content. I mean, I think this is really a sort of a great time for creativity and content creation, because the bar is being raised.
In researching this story, was interesting to me that one of the early stories from this year was that Amazon was looking to buy AMC theaters, and we had some discussion on that. But a lot of people are starting out in the industry to look at the way that Disney is approaching releasing their movies online as opposed to going exclusively to theaters, and the way Time Warner is doing it with their HBO Max streaming service. Is the ultimate game here to put the theaters out of business and buy them as a fire sales to hold the entire pipeline of, from creation through distribution?
I think there's some possibility of that, but I also wonder about, I don't know that most of the tech companies really want to be in that real estate business. The flip side of it is the Alamo Drafthouse model, which is really a restaurant social gathering place that shows movies, as opposed to a movie house that serves food. It is far more about the experience, and it's far more about, being able to have a glass of wine or, a pizza or whatever while you're watching the movie. And I think experiences will still be valuable, but they will have to be completely reimagined. The existing kind of theater model is very much like, how many lumens in the bulb, and what's the, the screen quality, and are the seats wide? It's not really thinking about, why do I come to a theater? And I think people will want to go to theaters, but not in the way that they used to. If it's going to be sticky floors and crappy seats, and I can get it, because Warner Brothers is putting all of their first run releases on a streaming service, I'd rather be in the comfort of my own home. Thanks. It's probably done terrible things to the popcorn business, but the thing that's
sorry, that tickled me. It's like, wow, there's a championing for the popcorn industry. It's you. Thank you, Farrah, for all you do for that industry.
I do love popcorn. But I think the other side of it that's quite interesting to me is seeing some of the early experiments in bundling. And like Disney's done it with Disney Plus, ESPN, and something else I'm forgetting. And so that's quite interesting.
Hulu. Hulu.
Yeah,
sorry.
Hulu, right? Hulu, because they own, the majority of that. So that makes a lot of sense. Other places figuring out how to monetize, I don't know that they necessarily have to increase their base rates or create new tiers of subscription services for some of them, but this, like, paying $30 for a movie, paying to see a live event, some of those things are going to be quite interesting. And then you do have these great little niche plays, like is it called Willow, that airs cricket? And
yes, it is actually.
Yeah, and like DAZN, which does fight sports primarily in the U.S., but just launched their service in like 200 countries. It's all kind of live sports, but in particular, ultimate fighting and boxing and things like that. So subverting the pay-per-view model with a subscription-based model for live fight sports. I mean, these are kind of niche plays, but the interesting thing is it's kind of the opposite of what we're seeing in these other big tech situations, where it's really creating a lot more consumer choice and actually allowing the content owners to realize some efficiencies that it was really hard to do in the cable per sub, set top kind of delivery of the experience. You had to market dozens of channels if you were AT&T Time Warner or a Comcast NBC Universal or a Disney. Now you can just market HBO Max and get all of those sub brands through that one thing. You can bundle services in a new way. The relationship to the actual cable provider will be interesting, and obviously companies like AT&T and Comcast will be fine either way because they are serving you both the access to the internet and the content that you want to watch on the internet. I've basically had a no cable TV subscription to whatever cable provider I've had now for probably 10 years, and I haven't been upset about it at all. And I keep adding new streaming services, even though I'm probably paying more now than I used to for the full package, because I hate Comcast a lot less for $80 a month than I did at $120 a month. So
the net promoter scores of these companies and these brands, and I think that's, I just wanted to add one point after my rant, is that the model is also quite engaging, because I know that my wife watches a lot of stuff. I know when Black is King came out, I think even Disney Plus has this feature where you could group watch things, and when Beyonce came out with Homecoming on Netflix, there was this whole group of people watching it collectively but remotely, and then in the last few months there's been these versus battles on Instagram and Instagram Live. And Too Short and E40 were on last night, and I think the best one I saw was when you had the reggae one a few months ago. Was it with Beanie Man? I think was on there, and these event type content. So there is, just imagine streaming that live. So if bringing that to bigger audiences or different, using the technology and the platforms, you could see that there's some creativity happening, and there is a great, I think, consumer driven approach to a lot of this. So I'm, as a consumer as well as a marketer, I'm really excited about the whole streaming and how these models are evolving, and how the content that's coming to the fore is not programmed by the same old stodgy networks. And now there is more room for different types of comedians, different types of musicians, different types of entertainment becoming to the fore, and with more and more people having 50, 60, 70-inch screens at home and having these technology to watch things collectively. I think the concept of going to the movie theater is becoming less attractive, and paying $30-$40 for something sat in front of your sofa but experiencing it remotely is appealing. So I'm excited about the future in this space, and I'm going to continue to see how much of this I can get for free before they finally find a way to get my credit card number.
Well, while we're on the subject of big screens and the types of entertainment that we're consuming, gaming in all its many forms dominated during the pandemic. Animal Crossing became a huge marketing opportunity because so many people were looking to Animal Crossing as an alternative to actually going outside. So some of that kind of rubbed off in the advertising world, and we saw that affect politics in terms of advertising, etc. Mobile gaming took off. I mean, everybody was on their phones, so obviously you're going to be downloading that latest game, start doing it. Then there was the big call that esports was going to take over and suddenly become a massive way for advertisers to reach to the sporting audience because sporting was shut down. So, of course, you go to esports. Now, that never actually happened to any large degree, but Farrah, I mean, gaming really came into its own during this time. What do we expect post-pandemic? What do you think is going to happen in the gaming space going forward into 2021?
So I'm going to do a quick plug for a company that I'm a strategy advisor for called 256. They specialize in this. So everything I know because I work with them. But I think there are a lot of really interesting things going. And the first thing I'll do is beg to differ slightly on the subject of esports. I think esports is not just like sports, but in games. It's League of Legends, it's World of Warcraft, it's Fortnite. And those things have done really well. The only thing is that some of the kind of big playoff games, the big sort of world champion series that often happen in person. They rent out a big stadium and people can stream it, but they can also be present for each other. Those things couldn't happen this year because of the pandemic. But there's a ton of interest in those spaces. And you see through Animal Crossing, you see through Fortnite. Now you're seeing through things like Roblox, new kind of articulations of those experiences where it's all the more creative and collaborative, where people are able to build their own environments in a game while other people are in it. I don't know how many people on this call or listening will remember Second Life, though it still exists. But there are some things that Second Life was trying to build before of real kind of creator tools.
I don't know, Joe. Joe, do you know anything about Second Life? I'm not sure about that, but
I'm clutching my Devo Dapto 3D printed model of myself right now.
All right, we'll go back to Farrah, but I had to do that.
The layering in of creator tools is a really interesting thing, and so you do have kind of Roblox is this like Minecraft meets Second Life meets Fortnite-y kind of experience, and it's taking off in a huge way. I think people played Animal Crossing not just because it was a substitute for going outside, but because it was a way to interact with people they couldn't be around. There were events held within Animal Crossing that you could attend. I think this is one of the things that the kind of esports genre does really well, which is large amounts of people all engaged in a single activity at the same time. But you also see kind of content and streaming around that with Twitch and Discord and some of these other things, people building communities, people not just playing games, but watching people play games. I referred earlier to AOC playing Among Us with some of the other members of the squad, and that got like tens of millions of views. Just AOC playing a pretty simple game available on your iPhone, and I think it's an experience, and it's something that is great sitting in your bedroom. You don't have to go anywhere to do it.
Farrah,
yeah.
There's one more thing that I would add to it as well. This is a very big yes and, which is the sociability aspect to it. And, for anyone that has kids, it's basically replaced, the phone. I mean, the prototypical idea of the teenager locked in their room with the coil of the phone coming underneath the actual door and being, locked for hours. Now they're actually just having a conversation, and the gaming part of it is important, absolutely. But it's the fact that this is how they socialize right now, and that plus, when you add in a platform like Twitch, you actually see that it's difficult for someone from a generational standpoint to kind of come to terms with it. But in a way, it is as much about the game as it is not about the game. This is bringing them together, and this is how they are socializing, for better or for worse.
Hashtag alone together. Hashtag alone together. But yeah, that phenomenon is so true, and I think from what again, I'm probably the only person on this call who's not a gamer, but there's certainly the audience for gaming is not just 14-year-olds, boys. And so the beauty of this, all of this space, is that it is actually very inclusive, and the gaming communities are quite large and getting more and more diverse. And so that, for me, sort of from the outside looking in, is fascinating. And I think the only flippant comment I'd make is I remember watching an esports Formula One race. I think there was actually a ringer. I think one of the drivers got a ringer but I was realizing that watching the esports version versus the real version, the esports version was actually more fun than the real version, and because it looked exactly the same, and I was more vested in the esport than I was in the human version, which was weird. And so I think for me, this is again another area that I'm sure anthropologists are going to be analyzing this to see what the impact is, and it's bigger than just playing a game. And the only other data point I think I saw was that Twitch makes more money from advertising than TikTok does. It was, which was an interesting revelation. So there's real business and real money to be made in this space.
So bringing up TikTok, it was surprising to me going through all the topics, how many times TikTok came up in the news this past year. Really, I wasn't originally going to focus on this subject, but the fact is, the threat of the way that they were handling data and the way that they were going and having it potentially be in China, the politics surrounding it, TikTok users organized around going after Donald Trump, so he organized around shutting down the entire service. Brands getting employees on it, saying we're going to use TikTok and we're going to encourage our employees to get involved with it. And in one case, a brand actually fired an employee for getting involved with it and trying to do paint mixing. That was Sherwin-Williams fired a young guy who was doing a very popular paint mixing account. Joe, this one just really kind of surprised me, but it shouldn't surprise me. TikTok has been a massive influential force during the past 12 months.
Yeah, I mean, it's I've been following it very, very carefully from I think it was the what was her name, TikTok grandma, who was responsible, kind of almost cheerleading or ringleading the Tulsa rally for Trump, which ended up completely empty because all of these TikTokers and others went and bought free tickets and clearly had no intention of showing up. That actually showed that the platform had some clout and influence. To the fact that I just saw recently the top 50 healthcare influencers or health influencers in the U.S. Number one is Fauci. Scott Gottlieb, I think, is number 3. Sanjay Gupta is maybe 24, and number 50 is Charli D'Amelio. And I'm like, wow. And by the way, she has over 100 million followers on TikTok. And then, of course, we saw, the Sherwin-Williams example, as you said, the longboarding example with, was it Ocean Spray? Just unbelievable to see what's happening here. And look, TikTok became the official platform for COVID-19 in terms of people being at home and expressing themselves, whether it was duetting, whether it was embarrassing parents dancing on TikTok. So it's been really a bit of a force of nature. And I think from a behavioral standpoint, just been a sign of the times. As I said, it encapsulates 2020, good, bad, and ugly.
Well, I think it's beyond 2020, right? Because every year there is some phenomenon, there is some platform, there is some technology, and you can imagine a lot of senior people, or especially senior marketers, saying, "What is this tick thing? Why should I care? And I think I saw a report the other day saying, top 300 CEOs, most of them are still not on Twitter, right? And what's her name? Dionne Warwick has just become the queen of Twitter. If you've been following her, and she even got Jack to acknowledge that she's the queen of Twitter. And the broader point I'm making here is that these cultural phenomena, which are often embedded in social, actually have a huge impact on society, on culture, on art, on marketing, and on business. And every year, a new one, or every 2 years a new one bubbles up. So if it was Snapchat, or if it was Vine, or if it was Foursquare all these years ago, and which ones survive and thrive. But what I like about TikTok is these TikTok stars aren't just dancers. And for me, a lot of it's like comedians. So a lot of comedians, female comedians. There's Uncle Roger, who's an Malaysian comedian who comments on rice, people cooking fried rice horribly. But there's just a lot more talent that's coming to the fore through these platforms than your traditional scripted or conventional artists. So what I love about this media, this channel, it's again another equalizer. It's another platform which is allowing talent and a more inclusive representation to come to the fore. You create something awesome, you build an audience, and you get discovered by the mainstream or status quo sort of 6 or 12 months later, after you become a phenomenon in this platform. So for me, that's what's inspiring about it, to see new artists come to the fore, new talent come to the fore, new content, new jokes, new creativity, and also with brands like Sherwin-Williams firing Tony Pilaseno for engaging with his audience, and then he goes and joins Florida Paints and say, hey, come and join us. So the good news is marketers are still behind, and hopefully there are some who actually are more future thinking and will, sorry, I say the good news, I was being sarcastic there, but hopefully marketers and advertisers and those experts listening to this are more open-minded to what comes next, because TikTok, I think, is going to stick around for a while, but there's going to be something coming up in the next 6, 12, 18 months to capture the imagination, and hopefully we see the value in it and not dismiss it.
And we couldn't wrap up this show without touching on one huge topic that we covered over the last 12 months. I don't know what's going on in the background there, but
that's not me. It's not me, Bob.
The fact that there was the Black Lives Matter movement going on in society here in the U.S. and around the globe, quite frankly, it really impacted marketers in a lot of deep ways. We touched on it at the beginning of the show, where we talked about the fact that the agencies and the brands had to do a lot of self-introspection. But let's talk a little bit more directly about the marketing challenges that were posed during this time frame. I mean, there were a lot of brands choosing sides. There were some brands that stayed out of it and tried to duck and cover. There were some that got involved with it and did very, very poorly with their efforts, and there were some that did well. What's your take on that, Sam? I mean, what's the ultimate report card that the marketing and advertising industry gets as a result of their efforts during this time to either support or, try to duck and cover the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, listen, you ask about the report card, and it depends who you're asking and who you're asking about. I've called out Nike, and they're equally are getting plaudits. I've called out Google, and equally they're getting plaudits. I've supported Ben & Jerry's, and I don't think there's any people calling them out. You got CrossFit CEO making comments and having to backtrack, and so you've got L'Oreal coming up with messaging and acknowledgement, and then you've got people calling them out for hypocrisy of how beauty is represented and how they'd cut ties with Monroe Bergdorf, a model who'd spoke out against racism in 2017. So the problem is most, if not all, are compromised in this area. And I love marketing and advertising. I always say this when I come on the show. I love the industry. It's been what I do for forever. Yet a lot of the comments, a lot of the complaints, a lot of the challenges have been very apparent for years and years. Is a lack of representation. I've been a marketing director who's received creative that had a stereotype, and I was able to, because I had the power. I was the client hiring. I would say, hey, can you tweak this because this is offensive? And of course, the agency, oh no, we didn't mean it like that. We didn't see that. So if you don't have representation in decision-making roles, you're going to continuously have the 4 or 5 racist ads. This summer, we went through this whole movement where brands had the black, avatar and Black Lives Matter, and all the ad agencies were pressured into releasing their data. A lot of them dragged their heels to release the data. When they released the data, guess what? It showed the lack of representation, because it's kind of quite obvious of diverse and minority talent. More agencies are hiring more women. I'm seeing there's been these new roles created for people of color, more Black people being hired into roles. But ultimately, the report card is still a D- until real meaningful change happens and real meaningful change lasts. Every year, the industry bodies will say, well, we need to do better when there's lack of representation. But what really changes? And I think, who was it? Alex Ohanian, who resigned his role. I don't know what board he was on. And he said, look, it should be given to a minority. And he Reddit, that's it. He stepped down for Reddit and said, hey, look, you have to hire. So that's how you're using your power to raise the bar, right? Where you're actually seeing your privilege and seeing your position and proactively taking a stance and taking what action you can. But I like to be optimistic, glass half full versus half empty. But when I look at who runs these companies, when I look at the tech companies we've just talked about, they're making things worse. They are actively making the things worse. And, Google, and I'll finish, this whole issue with Google and the whole challenge they've got with the AI researcher, Miss Gebru, and that how that's being handled in the same universe that they're getting plaudits for their ads, it really is troublesome. And I think for a lot of the minority groups in the industry, they've given the benefit of the doubt for year after year after year, and ultimately the change hasn't happened, and the companies aren't reporting back what progress they've made. So are these agencies telling you where they are and what they've done? Some have done stuff, but a lot haven't, and they're being quiet about it. But guess what? They're being outed because of their silence. And so if you go on LinkedIn right now, a lot of leaders, a lot of people of color are saying, okay, so, hey, agencies, we know you haven't done anything because guess what? You've gone quiet on this issue. So I think their reckoning has happened for the marketing and advertising industry. A lot of companies, I think, will try and be better, but there are some new innovative and I'll just wrap up saying, hey, there are actually some new innovative agencies and companies coming through who will role model the right behaviors and role model the right way. And I'm optimistic behind those, and they're getting support. So that, these check my ads types of organizations which are coming to the fore, which are talking about brand safety, led by minorities, led by women. I think, the future, which I look forward to, certainly.
I wanted to give just a slightly different perspective. Again, not a disagreement, but just another way to think about it. I had the pleasure this year working with the ANA, the Association of National Advertisers, to interview about 10 of their 25 odd keynoters at their Masters of Marketing. Mark Pritchard from P&G, Deborah Wall from General Motors, AC Bracey from Unilever, and I've said this before on the show as well. I was blown away by how much these companies were doing, and also impressed with these leaders, how outspoken they were, how they weren't hedging at all. They absolutely believed it, and the efforts that their companies were doing were phenomenal. I didn't know that. Most people don't know that. You don't see what these companies are doing in advertising or real-time tweets that are often misinterpreted as being completely self-centered and opportunistic. So I think the good news is that these companies are really doing a lot, and it isn't actually lip service. But where the disconnect happens, I suppose, is the fact that now I'll quote myself, because Saul was quoting me quoting him. Marketing is not a campaign; it is a commitment. And when you see companies committing to change, in fact, I remember saying to AC on my show, I said, Unilever is not a consumer packaged goods company. Unilever is an activist company. I mean, you guys are activists based on what I'm hearing. Like, bravo, kudos to you. And so I think coming out of 2020, early on, I was giving a virtual presentation, and someone said, so we've done these kind of austerity type of things, and we're not charging interest, and if you miss your payment, we're not penalizing you, and we've created all these relief tactics, if you will, for our consumers. When should we go back to the way things were? And my answer was never. Why would you go back? Why would you want to penalize and punish and hurt, and ding your customers if they're going through a tough time? Figure out a way coming out of 2020 that this actually becomes part of your DNA, part of the way that you do business. Even if we think about Zappos and in memory of Tony Hsieh, from a cultural standpoint, this has to be part of a company's DNA. And so, I know I sound like a broken record when I say this shouldn't be a messaging thing. It's not an advertising thing. It's not a campaign thing. This is about who you are, how you live your lives. And I think Farrah said it really, really nicely earlier on in today or tonight's, by the time you listen to it, it might be tonight. In fact, the way we're talking, it will be tonight when we're finished. You got to look at yourself in the mirror and say, who are we and who do we want to become? And when you answer those questions, a lot of these things become self-evident.
I think it's also really important just to tag on your commitment comment, which I think is brilliant. You have to listen to your customers and hear what they want to hear. You have to listen to your staff and hear what they want to hear. Maybe the best example is the NBA. When they went into the bubble and they started with the Black Lives Matter written right on the back of their jerseys and Black Lives Matter written right on the court, their jersey sales were cut in half because a lot of people in middle America didn't connect with the message. And on the courts, apparently, some people attribute to viewership being down. I attribute viewership being down to the fact that sports without fans is a very strange experience and it's not as fun. So that might be a little bit, but the NBA made a commitment to their employees, to the people who play on the teams, to the owners, that this is what we're doing. We have a voice, we're going to use it. And a lot of the people that were complaining probably weren't customers to begin with, so they stuck with it. And I think that commitment thing is something that's really lost on people because, and it goes back to something that Sam said earlier and what I was going to say, but he said it first, was it's the DNA thing. You should not make a bold statement in a protest unless you actually believe it and you're willing to ride out all the good and the bad right to the end. Because I think a lot of time people put their toe in it, and that's really when the backlash starts. You're either all in or you're all out, and the only time you should be all in is if it's something you truly, truly believe in. And the companies that win are the ones that truly believe in what they're doing.
Well, and you've also got to be willing to take the criticism that this is a new position for you. And so you do not have a track record of having been a good brand on these topics. Even the NBA, it was the WNBA that went first on that. And then it was the players on the NBA side who saw the bravery of the women and decided they wanted to emulate that. And then the NBA had to get on board. Right. So this was not coming down from the league. And, a lot of, and some people they got fined, they got punished in other ways. Like it was not an immediate, adoption of a new dream state of racial concord. This is not what happened here. And a lot of the other brands that came on board, you have to take your lumps where you say, okay, today we say Black Lives Matter, but for the last 30 years it hasn't. And for this brand, for 400 years it hasn't. But you've got to be willing to take those lumps and make the amends and do the work and do that, as much of that work in public as you possibly can, because that's where we don't believe you. The other thing I would say is this is great. The brands are doing it. Where are the agencies?
Well, I did call them out, but they didn't phone in yet, so maybe they'll come in. They'll come next week. But just building on that, Coca-Cola's in the press because they've come out and said, look, 20 years ago they were sued because they were actively hostile to black employees, and they haven't made any progress after 20 years. They've just come out and said that. So these problems run deep. These problems are real, and on the brand side. Now, if you didn't know that Coke had, you just go back 20 years and see the Coca-Cola court case where they actively had to admit that they were racist to black employees, and they tried to develop them through management, and now they've come back and analyzed and they failed. And I'm calling out the IAB, the WFA, the 4As. I did some analysis a few months ago, and I looked and I found 3 out of 130 people who are in positions of leadership. So again, I'm going to get in trouble for this. ANA, which you mentioned, Joe, Association of National Advertisers, they have their master circle, the most influential committee of marketing CMOs, 4 committees, 28 team leads, 0 black leaders in those positions, which was July when I did this analysis. There were 60% female, 30% minorities, but they had no black people on their CMO panel in charge of one of these committees. And so that's why I call them out, because show me that. I just like bring data to an opinion party. And so if the agencies won't be there because the industry bodies representing the agencies aren't diverse, they have virtually zero minorities and virtually zero black people on them. So this problem in December 2020 will manifest ongoing because they haven't changed, and they aren't changing, and they're not working on it because they're not reporting about it. And so the dissatisfaction with the status quo can only be addressed. And this is where I'm a Cindy Gallop fan, because she's just like, okay, you know what? We're just going to create our own without you. She was part of trying to reform the industry and realized that, no, it's not going to happen, because ad industry is white guys talking to white guys about white guys. And December 2020, that's still the truth. I believe there's so much more potential. There's some great companies. We Are Rosie is an agency model out there. Lots of other great organizations coming to the fore, trying to change things. And for me, I'll always be part of the solution. And I think 2021 onwards, the incumbents are going to be more under scrutiny than less. But I'm not optimistic on them changing, but I am optimistic of change happening to the industry by force, because we know that the actions haven't been taken. That there is no data to prove it is. There's reticence to show the data, and so I'm going to be part of the solution, and a lot of other people are doing great work to raise the bar and to make it better.
With that, it's time for the best of the fair, fail, foul. But before we go to that segment of the show, I do want to take this opportunity to thank my guests again for doing a very great job of keeping this stuff moving along. We're kind of long, but probably not the longest show we've ever recorded at the end of the year. So kudos to you guys. And I'm going to allow you to each do a shameless plug now before we get to that fair, fail, foul. Fair, fail, foul. So Farrah.
P505.
Yeah, I'm going to try again. First up, we got Farrah Bostic. You can find her at thedifferenceengine.co, not com.co. It's a consultancy that she runs and does some amazing work at. So tell us what's going on in your world, Farrah. What would you like to promote?
Yeah, so we are wrapping up analysis on a big project we undertook on our own this year, which is about how people make decisions, big decisions, long-term decisions, small decisions. And we did about 28 video diary studies, 1,600-person survey nationwide. We over-indexed on Black and Latin American respondents so that we could actually see if there were patterns that were visible within those groups for once, since we tend to peg to Gen Pop and therefore don't get enough to read. Anyway, very proud of the methodology. We are in the middle of analysis, almost done with it. And so in January, we're going to be launching a big report about basically different decision-making value systems that are emerging from the data that we've gathered, and how that affects how people make decisions across categories, as well as we think it's going to have interesting implications when we move into the next phase, which will be looking at decision-making value systems at work. Because if you have different systems and everybody brings those to work, clashes are inevitable. So be on the lookout for that. We'll be announcing that in January.
Yes, it sounds fascinating. And just pay attention to your Twitter feed to find out where to get it?
Exactly.
Okay, awesome. Now, next up, we have Saul Colt. You can find him at autozen.com. That's the home of a disruptive automotive service that I'm still not sure you can talk about yet, Saul, but I'll let you talk about it if you want. What do you want to say? What do you want to promote?
Bob, thank you very much for having me on the show, this past year. And, always appreciate being given a voice. If anyone wants to connect with me, I'm pretty much Saul Colt, one word, SAULCOLT, anywhere on the internet. And I'm always happy to connect and chat with people.
Great. That's awesome. Now, next up, we have Joseph Jaffe. You can find him at coronatv.show. That's the home of the Corona TV, the pandemic-inspired show that's going to continue past the pandemic and become something else, I'm sure. But what's going on in your world, Joe? What would you like to promote?
Yeah, you completely botched that, but I would say that very accurately described as well. It is the way I position the show is a show that was born in a global pandemic, but not defined by it. I had the name will change, so I made a decision on that, and watched the space to find out what the new name will be. I actually had Ms. Farrah Bostic on the show on the 17th, and she was guest number 167. It's hard to believe that I've created more content maybe this year than in my entire career. So it's been a transformational journey for me. On Thursday, December 24th, I turned 50 years old, and I'm doing a show on my birthday. I have two up-and-coming marketers, so I'm giving them their big break. One is called Seth Godin, and the other one is called Professor Philip Kotler. So come and hang out with
what you did there.
Philip. Come and hang out with Philip, myself, and Seth on Thursday, and let's celebrate marketing.
That's awesome. Yeah. If you don't know who those two people are, you're not paying attention to the marketing world. Last but not least, we have Sam Monnie. You can find him at cisquared.com. That's the home of the consultancy where he is a managing partner. So tell us what's going on in your world. What would you like to promote, Sam?
Yeah, so cisquared.net. So you'll find me cisquared.net.
So I always get that wrong.
Well,
cisquared.net.
it's the interwebs. It's fine. We're cisquared, not .net. Bob, I have a lot of things I'm enthusiastic about, but my greatest passion is really helping people unleash their creativity, discover their potential, putting people first, and that's what I get to do at CI Squared. We believe that human connection is the key to unlocking productivity. So we teach a lot about how to prevent miscommunication, misunderstanding, and just being frank, misunderstandings leading to just huge attrition, especially amongst the younger generations in the workforce. Employees are they're unfulfilled, right? Leaders fail to address that problem because they don't really realize how big it is. And we talked about that earlier. There's research that shows that 50% of millennials and 75% of Gen Zs have quit a job for mental health reasons, including anxiety, stress caused by their jobs. And leaders who don't invest in employees basically won't retain them. And I believe in upskilling and reskilling people to be fit for their future of work. And so specifically, we teach a storytelling framework that has been developed through neuroscience, behavioral economics, and we train people to be better leaders, to listen effectively, be aware of the biases, and to tell stories that inspire. And we show you how to deliver effective communication that really creates fulfilled employees, that actually delivers hard revenue results. And so I'm really enthusiastic about being part of this organization so I can help people learn such an important skill set. So really proud of the work we do at CI Squared, and check that out. And yeah, you mentioned before my Marketing Transformed, Across the Pond Marketing Transformed. Season 5 is coming soon, beginning of 2021. We're going to launch season 5. We've got some special guests coming along. And so looking forward to that as well.
That sounds awesome. That sounds like you got a lot of things planned for 2021. Sounds great. As for me, for more information about me or the show, visit thebeancast.com. There you can find a complete show archive. You can find out how to consult with me. And of course, you can find out how to advertise on this program. So check it all out at thebeancast.com. And now it's time for the best of the fair, fail, foul, a rundown of the best and worst of advertising, marketing, and public relations from the last year. First up, let's cover the fairs of this year. For me, the first one I'm not sure is on anybody's list except for mine because it's not really a marketing opportunity. It was a film that was going to come out in conjunction with the launch of the new Bronco by Ford. There was, I guess, an independent film producer who decided he wanted to do a story about the original Bronco sponsor or spokesperson called John Bronco. And to Ford's great credit, they continued to allow and support this effort. They gave them access to all their facilities and let them see research materials and supplied them with old ads and did all kinds of things to support this effort and got a lot of free promotion from it. So while it's not actually an ad for Ford or the Bronco, I think this was some really forward thinking on part of the marketers at Ford Motor Company. Any comments from the peanut gallery on this one?
I actually hadn't heard of it until I saw it on this rundown, and I looked into it. The creative was brilliant. I'd say maybe not the execution because one, I hadn't heard about it, and all of its numbers as far as like shareables and tracking things were pretty low. But as far as execution, it was incredible.
Yeah, I did check it out again. I hadn't heard of it, and then I started watching it, and I'm thinking, can I get to see the movie? So it's John Bronco creative, and the whole idea of sort of this nostalgia, but spokesperson, but storytelling. It's so relevant. So I'm hoping they kind of get a bit more support in 2021. And it just feels, I think the analogy and some of the participants were like the folks who worked on Uncle Drew, that worked with Pepsi, and we've seen this KFC Lifetime movie integration coming up. So there is some interesting stuff happening. And so I'm hoping this John Bronco stuff gets a bit more visibility out there, because I'd actually really love to see the movie.
It's also interesting when you think about the success of Ted Lasso, which I guess also came out of some ESPN promotional campaign.
Yeah.
It's really interesting how they did it. And I applaud this effort. And I think that more marketers should look at these opportunities to work with independent producers as opposed to just working to do an advertisement. And I think I think a great example is what went on with KFC with their love story featuring Mario Lopez. It was terrible. I mean, it's just like, it got a lot of buzz, but the content was terrible because it was run by the brand. And I think that this kind of partnership makes a lot of sense. Well,
what a downer on marketers. He's like lifting them up and then slapping them back down again.
Well, on the plus side, the two other fairs that I have these are the real fairs for the year. I mean, my John Bronco thing was completely self-centered. I loved it and I wanted to share it. But the Moldy Whopper ad and Google's Loretta ad from the Super Bowl, for me, those were the two best ads of the year. The campaign around the Moldy Whopper has taken lots of awards home already. Google's Loretta ad, every time I just load that sucker up, tears come to my eyes because it's so powerful. What do you guys think about these two as being the fairs of the year?
So
I assiduously avoid them. I avoid Loretta because it makes me cry, but I don't need any more reason.
Loretta is a great ad and is wonderful creative and a huge departure from, 1,000 Alexa play me a song commercials. But I'm not on the same page with the Moldy Whopper ad. I said this when it came out. I think people are a very visual, we're a visual society. That's why Instagram does so well. People watch a lot of commercials and video on mute. So I've got this visual of this like disgusting burger in my brain that is associated with Burger King, and I haven't eaten there. I don't eat there anyways, but they would be the lowest one on my list because I associate their burgers with moldy and gross now.
Well, the CMO, I think, Machado, he did come out saying, hey, this had a huge impact on to help build their reputation and deliver an ROI. So they're claiming it is working. But I have to say, the irony, of course, is that I didn't buy any Burger King products, but I have bought 2 McRibs since they came out because that was much more compelling to me personally and motivating. So I think maybe Burger King did great ads, but McDonald's still wins with marketing and scarcity because I had to get my McRibs on the day they were released, and I had to have 2 of them.
Now, the fails of the year were it was a little bit easier for me to kind of single out one that was the top fail of the year. Some runner-ups were, of course, Giant Foods promoting a super spread for their deli plates. I think that was kind of a big mistake on their part. Marks and Spencer asked, who wants a bite of Santa's Yum Nut, which was kind of a hilarious way to talk about cupcakes. But I think the biggest fail has to go to M United, who solicited Black Lives Matter murals for a boarded up Microsoft store in New York, the Microsoft flagship store that's on Fifth Avenue. They solicited for muralists to put murals on the boarded up walls with the phrase, while the issue is still relevant, which shows you just how out of touch the advertising agencies in this world can be. So what do you think about this one, guys?
I think Microsoft dodged a bullet on this one because they got they were exposed for the insensitivity. It was an awful way to handle this, and it was really bad. But imagine if they actually put up the billboard and all the people who, and we talked about this a couple times today. You know, Microsoft does not have protest in their DNA. Microsoft does not have supporting Black people in their DNA. I think far more people would have called them out for being opportunistic, and it would have been documented in so many more ways through video and photography than this. This was obviously shared, and I think it was probably forgotten about for the most part, except for people in the industry, where if they actually put the billboard out or the mural, it would have creeped way further into the public consciousness. But yes, awful.
And of course, the foul of the year has got to go to the Richards Group implosion. Stan Richards, the founder, had some not so considered words that caused a whole bunch of clients to leave the agency and for the agency to pretty much fall apart as a result of it. What do you think about this story, and how is it going to impact the industry as a whole?
I mean, he managed to step in it in both directions, calling Motel 6 basically the preferred choice of Klansmen, and then saying, so therefore we can't have a too black ad for them. I mean, this was special. It's probably a reason why people should retire at a certain point. 88 years old and still the chairman of the Richards Group. Like, I don't know how finger on the pulse of the culture Stan really could possibly be. I hate to be ageist about it, but I'm gonna be. So, like, you know, there's a lot of talk about the gerontocracy in DC, and I think that has come home to roost in other sectors of the country as well. I just was like, well, tell us what you really think, man.
You know, it's funny because when on Wednesday, Tom Dearline, who's a good friend of mine, he had his 15th TD Foundation event took place. Tom is a digital media old timer. He served our country. He went to Baghdad. He was critically wounded from sniper fire. He came back rehabbed and now has set up this foundation to help fallen heroes and wounded warriors. And, I kind of hosted a little after party for him, and we had about 100 people on Zoom, and we were all just reminiscing about the iMedia and Digital Trends days from 2001, 2002. And we're kind of joking, saying that, if for all the shenanigans that took place, this goes back to the can story from earlier, for everything that took place at all of these conferences, can you imagine if iPhones existed back then? I mean, it was game over. It would have been a very different time. And I think the reality is that the world now, for better or for worse, good, bad, and ugly, and I think we all feel pretty consistently about exactly, whether it is for better or for worse. We live in a world now where you live and die by your dumb comments, whether you choose to go and drunk tweet or whether you're taken in or out of context, and everything is recorded for posterity, and Google doesn't forget, and quite frankly, nor does anyone else. And so, I mean, 88 years old, he should have retired a long time ago. It's sad to see an agency implode and all the people's livelihoods that did. But nothing excuses him for those dumb actions. And I think, again, this is a good way to wrap it up and think about 2020, right? This was a year in which people revealed themselves, and if somebody tells you who they are, believe them.
Well, I was going to just add to that, to mitigate the accusation of ageism. This is about being in touch with culture and really understanding the world that is around and having the right insights and foresight. A friend of mine example for me is that the Pew Research in 2016 showed that the support for Black Lives Matter was only 40%. And you fast forward to 2020, they did the same research and it's now at 65%, which meant the majority of Americans supported it. And that meant brand activism and being on the right side of history was was paramount. And so if you aren't in touch with culture and don't have that representation in leadership and decision making roles, this is not to do with age. This is actually being in touch with what's going on. And so that for me is the takeaway. And yes, I feel for the people there, but what it teaches a lot of agencies and companies and businesses is you have to have the right representation in the right roles and decision making, which is in touch with the culture and reality. Because if you don't, the consequences could be an implosion of your business by saying and doing things which are completely out of touch.
Well, with that, have a suggestion for this list or just want to discuss it? Comment online, use the hashtag FairFailFoul. That's pound FairFailFoul. Well, we did it. We did another year. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, visit our website at thebeancast.com. Click on the subscribe link there. If you're an Apple Podcast listener, we've also provided a direct link to our listing on that service, or just search for the BeanCast in the podcast directory on the Apple Podcasts app. And whichever podcast directory you use, when you subscribe, please leave us a review. Got a comment? Have a question? We'd love to hear from you. Just send your emails to beancast@gmail.com. Opening theme was performed by Joe Seibel. Closing theme by C-Jax. Thanks for listening. I'm Bob Norp. We'll be back again on January 11th, so hope you'll join us then.
You know what I mean? It's like if it's, you know what I mean? I don't know, man. It's just like, okay, it's like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like totally like that. It's like, I don't know, like if it's, you know, it's like, you know what I mean? Yeah, it's just like kind of, it just seems like it's just like almost exactly.
But yeah, thank you, Bob. This was awesome. And Farrah, we need to talk. I need to just be in your presence and just listen to you and take notes, because you literally, you're the sage. You're the sage of the BeanCast. I love being on the show with you. Sorry, so, I mean, Saul and Joe, I love you too. But I mean, yeah, Farrah was on a different level to me today.
Yeah, whatever.
Oh, man.
Well, thank you. That's nice of you to say.
Yeah.
Beans.